Welcome back to Demystify Sci. I'm Shiloh.
I'm Anastasia.
Today we are talking about magic, but not really the stage show kind of magic. More magic as defined by our guest today, Dean Radin, who speaks of magic as humans trying to make sense of things they can't explain. And so Dean has had an extraordinary career, mostly studying parapsychological phenomenon. So all of the bizarre things that we hear about with people doing mind reading and out of body traveling, what's it called? Remote viewing, I guess. And what's really cool about Dean's path is that he's had a chance to work with some really serious people on very serious projects at serious institutions for many, many years. So he was part of the Stargate Project, which is at the Stanford Research Institute. This had some interesting intelligence overlap as well with the CIA that we get into. He worked at Princeton in I think it was one of the pioneering parapsychology labs in the country. And right now, he's the chief.
Before you get to right now, he also worked at Bell Labs. So he has this really deep electrical engineering background that informs all of the experiments that he does to this day.
Right, he's an experimentalist. He's the chief scientist at the Institute of Noetic Sciences I think it's in San Francisco. And he's an experimentalist. He is not so much a theorist, but he does have a wide grasp on what has happened in the past 150 years that people have been looking seriously at this kind of parapsychological phenomenon. So he has, in some sense, a pretty dispassionate view of it, where he's able to take a step back and say, I just am collecting data here. There's interesting stuff going on. Everybody knows it's interesting. The government's been doing these experiments for years, and we don't know what's happening. And of course, that's the most interesting science to us, is the things that lack explanations. And that's what we do here at the show.
And we get into a lot of the details about Dean's career and how he moved from being somebody who is an electrical engineer to being somebody who is actively studying these topics. We talk about how the field has changed. We talk about this interplay between mind and matter, some of the most interesting experiments and some of the most interesting findings he's come across. And so it's a pretty wide-ranging conversation, but it's a really fun one because it's a topic that is, like Dean says, one that can't often be broached in polite society, and yet everyone talks about it with great interest behind the scenes.
It's also super cool because this is the first long-form podcast that Dean has done. I think he said he did 1,200 interviews.
800
interviews. He's done a lot of interviews. This is the first long one. And so I think we get into a really relaxed space that you're not going to find anywhere else. So I think you guys are going to love it.
And if you love what we do on the podcast, consider coming over to patreon.com/demystifysci and donating a couple dollars a month. We run the program without sponsors, without advertisements, and we really, really, really could use your help. We have a crack team of amazing patrons. We get together once a week on Sundays and just kind of hang out. We call it our Sunday chat, and everybody brings ideas that they're thinking about, and we're wrestling with what science looks like. We're wrestling with how economics works, with what the future design of society should look like. It's these really just massive perennial topics that we cycle through. And so if you're interested, come over to patreon.com and you can join us there. If you're not big on the Patreon model, we sell t-shirts down below. There's also a link in the description for an Amazon affiliate purchase, which means that if you go to Amazon through that link, even if you don't buy Dean Radin's books through that link, all of the shopping that you do on Amazon through that link gives us a couple of cents on every dollar that you spend. And so consider combining your love of Demystify Sci with your love of therapeutic shopping.
All right, guys, enjoy this conversation. I think you're going to love it. Tell us what you think in the comments, or come on over to Discord or Facebook, and I will see you there.
The scientific revolution starts now.
The Demystify Sci podcast.
Let us see in the dark.
You're basically like, look, magic was a thing that people did for hundreds, if not thousands, if not tens of thousands of years. And modern anthropologists went in and they were like, this is so primitive and savage and dumb. And then there was this moment where it's like, okay, well, we don't deal with magic anymore because it's just, we're too civilized for that. And what I think happened at that moment is that it went underground, and it's not like we lost. This is what Shiloh's saying. It's not like we lost our deep passion for magic or our desire to stick magic into things that we don't understand. We just learned to kind of not talk about it, and so now it shows up in all of these weird places that perhaps aren't the best places for it. Like if we could honestly and clearly actually discuss the magical stuff, because you also say, it's very, very difficult to be somebody who studies psi phenomena. You have this really funny line about, like, it doesn't matter if the scientist is wearing Spider-Man underpants. He'd
I
never
actually have
admit.
it here. I'll just read it for everybody. So all fledgling scientists learn to maintain a serious, sober demeanor at all times, even if they're secretly wearing Spider-Man underwear. The saddest people on earth are junior faculty hoping to get tenure at a university because they're forbidden to smile in public, crack jokes, or make eye contact, and they absolutely can't be seen as being even mildly interested in tabloid stories. It's the kiss of death to put one's 20 plus years of education and training in jeopardy by being perceived as too sympathetic about controversial topics. And of course, psi being one of those controversial topics, and magic being the bigger umbrella under which we have traditionally thought about psi events. But man, I mean, I think everybody listening and all of us have experienced weird stuff in our lives, right? You think of someone and the phone rings, or I don't know, just weird synchronicities. I think everybody's pretty comfortable with that, and yet we don't have a way of talking about that in the public discourse, or certainly at an institutional level, or in any serious manner that doesn't just get eye rolls and dismissal outright. And it's funny because even scientists are people who are watching videos about this at night, but there's no way they can talk about it institutionally. And so what's the future of that? Is there a way out of that? Is it something institutions can deal with? I'm sorry I'm throwing so much at you. I'm just so excited to talk to you. So
Yeah, so if I had a single message, the message would be that magic isn't magic. Right? So when we use words like magic, it's a placeholder for something that we will eventually understand and have different words for. And if you look in almost every scientific discipline, you will find something eventually referred to as magic. And what that means is that it's doing something in a way which is quite awe-inspiring, but we don't have a good explanation for it yet. So there's a property in quantum mechanics that's called magic. And mathematicians use magic matrices all the time. I mean, you find it everywhere. In astronomy, virtually every discipline you look at, you'll eventually find something saying it works like magic. And then you decode what that means, and it means, well, something happened in a very strange way, and usually in an amazingly fast way, or something happening at a distance. So the idea of magic, as Arthur C. Clarke and others have said, that it's a technology that we don't understand yet. Or I would put it slightly better, that it's a science that we don't understand yet. And so the science in this particular case means that there's something peculiar about the nature of consciousness that is deeply wrapped into the notion of what we think we talk about as magic. And up until very recently, even academics couldn't talk about consciousness except in two ways. You're a neuroscientist who can talk about how the brain gives rise to consciousness, probably. If you're an anesthesiologist, you can study why it's there and how you can make it go away, meaning awareness. And maybe if you're a philosopher, you can talk about it in terms of the mind-body problem. And that's it. Unless you're a far-out physicist or a physicist in the 1920s who was developing quantum mechanics, because all of them were idealists, in which case it was not a big deal. But science goes through fads and fallacies, and periods where things are allowed to be talked about and other times when they're not allowed to be talked about. So I would say we're in a period now where this spiral of topics that we can talk about is on an upwards curve. It is starting to be okay again to talk about it. And the moment that you start entertaining alternative ideas about what consciousness is and where it comes from, if it comes from anywhere, suddenly the whole spectrum, you think of consciousness on a big spectrum, a chunk of it is physical in the sense that we see neural correlates of consciousness. And we all know what that is internally. how to cast that into a scientific way requires something other than reductive materialism. And so when you start looking in those other directions, dual aspect monism, idealism, all of the rest of it, suddenly mystical and psychic experiences and magical experiences and synchronicities and all the rest of it is seen as part of the spectrum.
It creates a great challenge, though, because we have kind of made this perhaps uneasy deal with science, where we devote ourselves to materialism in the scientific project, where we say that there's material cause and effect. You can simplify it down to, okay, atoms are resonating and that leads them to exchange light, which is what gives rise to photons. And so you always have this
Mechanism.
thing, a mechanism and a thing at the bottom of it. But consciousness really throws a spanner in the works of that, because it seems like all attempts to find a mechanistic, mechanical, material theory of it have failed spectacularly.
Or they're less than satisfying.
Yeah. And maybe there is some sort of a substance, in quotes, that we will eventually say, well, it's part of the fabric of reality. It's, but as a metaphor, reality is a tapestry, and there's made out of threads that go in the warp and the weave. And so what we think of as material things like atoms and so on are part of the fabric, but the rest of it is held together by something else, which is not quite physical, at least in terms of what we think of physicality today. But maybe it is, right? I mean, science is young. This is why it doesn't bother me at all that we don't have a really good explanation for these things yet, because at the leading edge of science there's an infinity of things we don't understand yet.
I love defining magic as the leading edge. It's the leading edge of what's known, right? That makes a lot of sense.
It's a strange kind of leading edge, because everybody knows what it's like to be conscious. Probably all the way down to plants, who knows, atoms maybe have a certain kind of consciousness, but we certainly know what it means to feel conscious. And it doesn't seem like, I mean, as best as we can tell, it doesn't seem like it's something you can put under the microscope and measure what that is. We don't have a good measure for it yet. And so we would call it non-physical at this point. It doesn't have the same level of physicality as other things. Within the field that I work in, many are thinking that we're dealing with something like information, which is not quite a cop-out, but it's as close as we can get to saying it's not exactly physical, but it's like information in the sense that information isn't quite physical either. You take an electromagnetic wave and you modulate it a certain way, it's still all physical, and yet the way that you modulate it can have extremely different consequences. So is the modulation a physical thing? Kind of. But on the other hand, not in terms of the information that it conveys. So one of the ways I describe this to people is, what does it mean to have that information could have exactly the same amount of underlying energy, but the consequences of it would be vastly different. So the way to demonstrate it is that you go up to somebody and you whisper in their ear, "I love you." And you look at the physiological response as a huge amplification that you will find. And now you do exactly the same thing with the same number of words, with the same number of energy expended, but you say, "I hate you." And you get a very different physiological response. So something decoded this information and was amplified in a way that we can see very strong differences. Maybe whatever consciousness is, it has the capacity to do that too. So a very small amount of, quote, transfer of information from one place to the other, or maybe it's not a signal at all, or like quantum entanglement, and there are correlations that occur, that through that correlation, you can kind of transfer, you can kind of signal. Just again, it's kind of like with quantum entanglement, there's nothing going from here to there, but they're still connected in some way. Maybe that's what's going on in this case, especially in the case where people have experiences of interconnectedness, which is one of the ways that these kinds of phenomena are oftentimes felt.
Maybe,
Yeah, I mean, one thing we like to do to just simplify things in terms of defining, just keeping things straight, is that you really, when you think about information, it's an abstraction, right? It has to do with how we process the world fundamentally as human beings at the end of the day. It's more labels that we can put, more handles that we can put on a situation. But physical reality seems like it's only half of the picture. So if you want to say like what is physical, well, like this chair, this table are physical, right? They're bodies, they have surfaces, they have insides and outs, right? But everything else is really a relationship among bodies or relationships among other relationships. And so you get into these thick layers of abstraction really quick. And I love physics. I have, worked in physics for many years, but I often find it funny when people think that because I'm interested in physics, that's the totality of what I'm interested in. In other words, that physics could somehow explain everything. Whereas I'm like, no, like physics is just the science of bodies in motion interacting with each other. It's actually far less powerful than it has the air of being, because it can only deal with that little aspect of the universe. What about all of these stories that are playing out in our daily lives? What about all of this drama and the love and the hate and the war? Those things are not physical processes. Those are magic, for lack of a better word. Those are very, very difficult. Even emotionality, right? If you go and look at personality tests, there's dozens, maybe hundreds of different personality tests. People have no idea how to wrestle with the emotional landscape in a scientific sense of what's going on in our daily lives. And that's at least half of the universe, as far as I can tell, is this multiple layers of nested abstraction that really governs how our physical lives play out at the end of the day. So I wonder if science even has a chance of wrestling with that. Or sometimes I think, maybe it's just better to leave it to the arts and the literature and the ballet and the drama to deal with that other side of the universe. But it seems like you think that science can tackle the problem of consciousness.
We always have a provincial view of what we can know. I mean, you don't have to go back far in history for people to say, well, we'll never understand fill in the blank. And eventually we do gain some understanding of it. So do I think we will eventually understand what we would say is magic, enchantment, divination, all those sorts of things? I'm confident that eventually we will, provided our species gets through its adolescent phase, or maybe even pre-adolescence phase. So if we're wise enough or clever enough or lucky enough to be able to exist for another couple thousand years, and we're not wiped out by AI or by some other calamity, will we know at least a lot more about these things? Absolutely, we will. Will we ever get to the point where we completely understand it? That I'm not so sure. That maybe is some sort of an asymptote, and you can't actually get beyond a certain point, at least not in our form. So some of what we're dealing with is that our language is pretty limited. Other languages, even on the earth right now, are probably better equipped to talk about these things than English is, but English is at least flexible and can move around quite a bit. So I'm optimistic, but of course I'm chronically optimistic. I think if I were not very optimistic, I would not be doing the kind of research that I've been doing, because there's a lot of pressure not to do it. Somehow, whatever my personality is like, it likes the challenge of it, and I remain optimistic that eventually, yeah, I mean, even since I've been doing this, do we know more now than we did 40 years ago? Yeah, we know quite a bit more. So that's why I'm optimistic.
Maybe we can go through the evolution of the field as you've been a part of it, because you went into psi research when it was, I would say that it was something that wasn't considered even approaching a mainstream discipline. I feel like perhaps
And even
now,
before that, right? You were not always in the psi field, right?
Well, it depends on what it means to be in the science field.
oh no,
psi.
not psi,
Psi,
not
sorry.
science.
Oh, psi. Yeah, so let's see. I first read a book on parapsychology when I was about 14. So my interest was already there. I didn't think of it probably before that as anything more than fairy tales and things like that, science fiction. But it was when I was 14, I read a book by critic Hansel, who is attempting to debunk some of the J.B. Ryan stuff. And my reaction from all of that is, A, there is science that can be done. B, this guy's trying to rip it apart and not convincing me very well. And C, it convinced me to go ahead and start looking at what Ryan and others had written. And I found his case much more persuasive because he was actually doing empirical work rather than simply trying to tear it apart. Most of the time by creating scenarios that were either unreasonable or demonstrably false. So that's kind of pushed me in my teenage years towards thinking that, well, lots of people are interested in these kinds of reports. I never, as far as I can tell, as a child, I never had psychic experiences. No one in my family ever talked about it. We're completely non-religious. So it wasn't a topic that came up, except it's saturated science fiction and fairy tales and the tales of the mystic masters of the East and all of that. So it was sort of there all the time. But it was the idea that it could be tested, which really caught my attention. That's one of the reasons I think I decided to first go into engineering and later into psychology, and now doing what I'm doing, is the idea that there are things that are very strange out there that you could test. And you look at especially the sociology of science, you find that that's where the breakthroughs happen. It's that residuum, as William James talked about. It's the things that don't fit, which become really interesting. And I always found that whenever I'm studying something that was pretty well known, I got bored instantly. I figure, why bother? Why would anyone want to spend their life studying something which is like 99% already known? So, but I think that's probably true for a lot of scientists. We're curious about things, and you're going to be curious about the things that we don't understand, much more so than the things that textbooks have already laid out. So,
could you tell us a tiny bit about the Rhine studies? Like, what was it? What sort of findings were coming out that were piquing your interest?
Well, and Ryan is probably best known for the ESP card test. That's like one whole class. And then the other class are the studies with dice, the psychokinetic studies. So partially what caught my attention on it was, here's a very simple method. The statistics were very straightforward, even though for a long, long time, many decades, psychologists who didn't like this kind of stuff said there must be something wrong with the statistics because it's just too good. And that was finally settled back in the 40s or 50s when statisticians were saying that as far as the methods would go, statistical methods, there was nothing wrong. And the statisticians went on to say, we can't say anything about the interpretation of the results, but at least mathematically it is sound. So I thought, okay, well, that's pretty interesting. The method is simple. You get statistics, which are quite interesting. Effects that they were reporting at that time was you can use it for telepathy tests, you can use it for clairvoyance, for precognition, and all of them were showing interesting results, usually with selected subjects. Like this is probably at some low level something that everybody can do, but like every other realm of human performance, some people are talented. So you go looking for people who are talented, you make sure that there's no sensory leakage or other ways of someone unconsciously getting information. You get rid of fraud as a possibility. You do everything that you can in the laboratory to make sure that the results that you get are what they appear to be. And he did that. And in a book called Extrasensory Perception After 40 Years, which was published in 1940 approximately. So it was looking back, oh no, it was must have been around 1920. Nope, got it wrong. Extrasensory Perception After 60 Years, published in the 40s, and it went from 1880 to 1940. And he did the first meta-analysis in that book. By one of the appendices was all known replications, his own and other people's replications, with the number of trials and the percentage of probabilities and all the rest of it, all laid out in this one huge long appendix. And I thought, wow, just as a methodology, he's like ahead of everybody else because he recognizes that you must have replication. The methods are simple. People are easily able to replicate it if they want to. Not everybody can, but enough of them did in order to show that there's some kind of real effect. Well, once you accept that, that changes everything. Like what psychologists completely missed something really interesting, which just happens to match what people report in their experience. Well, isn't that interesting? So it was that early recognition of curiosity about the ESP tests, and similarly with dice tossing. So with dice tossing, you can see a little bit more easily how methodologies had to evolve in order to gain confidence. So initially, it was you hold a dice and you toss it, and then they figure, well, that's no good because maybe you can manipulate it. And then an examination of the dice, and you realize that in a dice that you would have in a board game, the dice are not balanced because one side has 6 little divots in it and the other one has 1, and so it changes the mass. And sure enough, you roll those dice enough times, you'll get 6 coming up more often because there's less mass in that side, and that is what you see. So they had to go to perfect dice, and they said, okay, well, now you can't handle it. It has to go inside a cup. Well, even a cup, you're sort of manipulating it. So, okay, let's have a machine throw it. You're still recording by hand. Let's photograph every single toss. Let's toss 2 dice. Let's toss 60 dice at once. Doesn't make any difference. So that you go through this whole sequence over years, decades even, and they still got good results. And other people were replicating it as well. And so after a while, I figure, well, why isn't this ESP and PK accepted? At the time, 1920s and 30s, it was accepted until people got distracted by various wars. And suddenly physics got very, very important because it was building better bombs. And something about somewhere between the First and Second World Wars, it was still okay. Like it looked like the evidence was good. After the Second World War, it crashed. And maybe there was a huge amount of pragmatism that came to fore at that time. We didn't have patience with things like ESP. I don't know exactly how to understand that, but that is what happened. So roughly around the same time was the rise of behaviorism in psychology, which denied the existence of consciousness. So you have a confluence of things coming together, that all of which were like super pragmatic and getting rid of anything that might even be on the hint of spooky. And so it didn't exactly go away because it's a thing, it's a real thing. But from an academic standpoint, it became more and more difficult to study these things within the academy.
By the way, what's a good result? You said that they were getting good results. So does that mean that certain individuals were performing well beyond chance, or does that mean on average people were performing beyond chance? What is good?
Yeah, good was if in a ESP card test that you would expect by chance to get 5 correct in a deck of 25, some people could get 8 on average over many trials. Well, statistically, the odds against chance are a gazillion to 1. So that's like it's not happening. So you start looking for alternatives. How could they achieve that? They're getting just a little bit more than chance, but consistently and enough so that it statistically adds up over time, and you end up with I don't know exactly how many, but 5, 6 sigma deviations from chance. I mean, enough to say, well, I mean, in physics, if you get a 5 sigma result, that's considered a discovery that can get you the Nobel Prize. The difference here
but these
is
are like
we
the
don't.
same individuals longitudinally. Like there's just people who on repeat tests continue to perform well.
Yes. And one of the things noticed after a while is that you'd find somebody who was quite good at these kinds of things. For a long time, they would do quite good, and then they start to get bored, and they would eventually go right down back to chance. And so what they began to figure out, and we still know today is quite true, is that a lot of this is mediated by the unconscious. Also by motivation, also by not so much belief is certainly a factor, but in people who were able to do this, they had high belief because they could see the results they were getting. But if that starts to clash with boredom and with lack of motivation and wanting to get out of this thing, you could squash it easily.
And so, as you were moving through this field and getting interested, what were the experimental approaches that you were taking?
It wasn't really until graduate school that I started to run experiments. I was already doing experiments without even calling it that when I was an undergraduate in electrical engineering. Because when I was going to an undergraduate school, every other person was high on LSD all the time, including some of my engineering buddies. So for one of my projects, I built an EEG, and I wanted to see what would happen for somebody who's on LSD all the time, because one of the things that happens is that your reticular formation of the brain is not stopping things down as much. You're letting a lot more sensory stimulation. So I asked my friend, who is basically 2 out of 3 days, he was on some amount of LSD. Come in when you're high on this, and we'll do an experiment with flashing lights, and I'll measure what's happening in your brain. And then on like the one day where you're not on LSD, come in, we'll do the same thing. And I was curious to see what would happen with the reticular formation, and sure enough, I was able to replicate what I had read about, which is if you're high on some of these substances, it's all going in, it's not being censored. You can see that in the brain responses as well. Whereas if you come in and you're sober, a lot of it is blocked. So I got interested in that because of the idea at the time, and still true today, that reason why we're not all walking around being super psychics is because we're blocking most of it. In fact, not only psychic stuff, we're blocking practically everything all the time. We're making a very thin cartoon of what is going on out there, and we only pay attention to things that we need to. I mean, and now with being distracted by cell phones all the time, we're even getting a smaller cartoon, a tiny, tiny little cartoon of what's happening. And if we're lucky and we're happening to be driving a car and somebody else is looking at their cell phone, you just hope that they're paying enough attention to realize that you're there. So early on then, as an undergraduate, I was already playing with these ideas and using what I had learned in engineering to be able to empirically look at it. And then in graduate school, I don't remember how this came about, but one of my professors was very interested in consciousness. He's a mathematics professor. And we started talking about it and said, well, I'm kind of interested in these things I keep hearing about remote viewing, clairvoyance studies. And so he said, well, why don't we try it? So he was a popular guy on campus and was able to recruit people who thought that they wanted to try this. And my role was being the hypnotist. And I read books about it. I didn't really know very much, but I knew how to do it. So I would semi-hypnotize people, and then we would try remote viewing with them. And sometimes we got pretty good results. So I thought, that's interesting. This is not that difficult. And we're doing it not in any official capacity. I mean, since many years ago, I've been on institutional review boards, sometimes as the chairman. And I look back on that and saying, ew, we've never had any approval to do these human subjects tests, and that was probably not a great thing to do in the academic world. But nevertheless, that's what we were doing. We're doing it for fun. And this professor had other professors who were secretly interested in this. And so I saw immediately there was kind of an invisible college already in graduate school where lots of faculty were interested in it, but everyone would swear everybody else to secrecy because they didn't want anybody to know. And so that was really the first time I got the sense of this is strange because there's a lot of interest, but we can't talk about it. Because up to that point, I was a little naive and thought that academic freedom meant that. And then I learned that that's not really true.
I think that's a rite of passage for anyone who goes into the academy, where you get to a certain point where you realize that there are different motivations at play than the ones that you expected idealistically before entry.
Yeah. So, and then there are political considerations, like people don't want you to study certain things because it might hurt their business. That's part of it. And there are religious reasons, and there are lots and lots of pressures that inform you about what you can and cannot talk about and what you can study. But again, something about my personality reacted badly to that. I did not like this idea at all that there were all these constraints in a field where, or at least within an aspiration of science that is open-ended. Like, aren't we supposed to be able to study anything? Apparently not. So that was kind of disappointing. That's one of the reasons why I decided when I got my doctorate to not continue in an academic world. That I felt that there would be more freedom is not quite the right word, but at least less expectations on you in an industrial lab where it was much more pragmatic, like we're making stuff here, so it'll be usable. And that also was appealing to the engineering side of me because I like to make and do stuff as well. The psychology side in graduate school for my doctorate was kind of an accident because I was really interested in cybernetics and the beginnings of AI in engineering. And so I had two choices. I could go into hardware engineering because one of my advisors at the time was David Waltz, who developed one of the first massively parallel AI type machines, the company called Thinking Machines. And so that was the direction I could have gone in. The other direction was the software direction, cognitive modeling, things like that. And so there was only one other professor on campus who was interested in cognitive modeling in an AI direction. It happened to be in educational psychology. That's where I got my doctorate. So that's like an accident. I was sort of intrinsically interested in educational psychology, but not really. It was really more of a matter of, well, this is a way that I can pursue an interest of mine and get a doctorate. And thinking beyond that, no one actually ever mentioned to me that, when you get a doctorate in this is what you can do with it. Like, it never occurred to me, and it never occurred to anybody to even mention to me, like, what are you going to do when you graduate? I had no idea. I mean, so I think, like, in retrospect, I'm thinking, what, don't we have advisors who are supposed to tell you things about this? Why didn't anybody mention it?
They're busy
But
with paperwork.
fortunately, I discovered that there was a job called human factors engineering or human factors psychology, which fit in really well with my background. And so that's how I ended up with my first job, even though the very first place that I interviewed was the Pear Lab at Princeton that was doing psi research. And so I was a candidate for that. I thought this would be the best thing ever to be able to start your career doing that. And I was convinced indirectly by saying this would not be the best place to begin your career, even though it was at Princeton, because you would then be you would be tarred and feathered with working in a very controversial field, and that is not a good way to start a career. So
What year was this happening, by the way?
that was 1979.
Interesting.
So they were at the point where the Pear Lab was building up, and they were looking for somewhere between a psychologist and an engineer and something like that to take over the psychological aspects of what they were doing, because they were in an engineering school, and they wanted to be careful not to step on the toes of people in other departments. So it would have been easy to get someone like me because it sort of straddled those fields anyway. But in retrospect, they're absolutely right. They know you get a regular job for a while, and let's keep in touch. And as it turned out, 6 years later, I was working at Princeton, but I already had conventional background at that point.
And were you working directly in parapsychology by the time that you got to Princeton, or is there still a longer transition before that cemented
So I
itself?
started working at Bell Labs, and that was a good place. That's a good starting place for somebody at the time, because it was the largest industrial lab in the world, and it's completely mainstream, and you get to meet lots of other people that are doing the best that they can. But I found that I got bored pretty quickly. Like we were building better telephones, essentially. And yeah, it's useful. Like way back when, this was like 1980, when I started, we had video phones. I said, "Oh, that's great. Let's do it. Let's make these work." And how long did it take before we had anything from the telephone companies that was like a video phone? Never.
Yeah.
And part of my frustration there was a lot of the things that go on in the human factors world are so obvious. Like why would anybody build this to do this? This is difficult to use. You guaranteed you're going to have mistakes. It's just mind blowing. And I got tired of that after a while. And well, why would you do this? And eventually I realized, oh, it's because engineers build these things. Engineers are not thinking like humans, or at least not like the people who are going to end up using the equipment. And so that was kind of frustrating. So I started in my time off at Bell Labs. We had about 20% of our time that you didn't have to account for because you're waiting for other people to do something. I started doing psi experiments.
Like on your colleagues, or
excuse me,
on your colleagues, or who were your test subjects?
on my colleagues. So I took advantage of trips. We would go on various business trips, and I managed to squeeze in visits to laboratories of people, a few laboratories in the United States that were doing these kinds of experiments. So I was meeting people in the field who were doing things and getting more impressed because I knew what big science was like in Bell Labs, and they were just as good as anybody else I ever met. And so I figured, okay, you can do this. Like you could be a scientist and do these things using the same tools and techniques and get really interesting results. So one of the people I met was Helmut Schmidt, who is the pioneer who created the random number generator experiments. And at that lab, I saw that he had like a whole little museum of equipment that he had made, one of which was a circle of lights machine. So the circle of lights, it's detecting radioactive decay from strontium-90 or actually it was more like pitch blende. It was pitch blende that is weakly radioactive. And so he puts in a Geiger counter, and every time it detects a radioactive particle, the latencies are fundamentally random, right? It's considered in quantum mechanics that there is no cause for why this thing happened. So the latencies are truly random. And what he would do is he built this thing where there's lights that would light up in sequence until a radioactive particle was received, and then it would reverse the direction. So it would automatically count how many times it went clockwise, how many times it went counterclockwise, which obviously was related back to the randomness in these particles. But you'd give somebody a task. The task is make it go clockwise as much as you possibly can. So that means half the time, kind of slow down the radioactive particles so it keeps going. And if it does reverse, we'll suddenly speed it up again so that it'll reverse the direction and start going backwards the other way. So you have like a dual task already built in. So I looked at that and I was admiring it. And he said, "Would you like to borrow it?" "Yes, please. I would borrow that." So I took that machine back to Bell Labs and I worked on it myself, and I got my colleagues to work on it. And they did the statistics on it and showed, holy smoke, it actually, on composite, many trials, it works. Like we can make it behave in a non-random way. And then, of course, you do control tests where you just set it up and you leave the room, and later you come back and look at the count, and those were all at chance. So I thought, well, that's more interesting than building a better telephone. Then I started doing precognition experiments. So this was before personal computers, and it was just at the beginning of graphic display tubes where you could make graphical things. So it was part of my job as a human factors person to make it easier for us to design things on a graphic interface. So a partner and me came up with a graphic description language. And so one of the ways I exercised that was to come up with a precognition test where you see a big matrix and you have to click a spot where you think a random selection would be shown. So you're trying to pick, like dowsing for where the randomness is going to end up. So I did that experiment on myself and my colleagues, and we got some interesting results. And at this point, this was still not exactly secret, but it was on my own time, and I didn't know exactly what to do with it. But I decided that maybe I should go to a Parapsychological Association conference and just talk about it, see if anybody was interested in it. I should back up that when I was in graduate school, I was at the University of Illinois in St. Louis, 1978. There was a meeting of the Parapsychological Association at Washington University in St. Louis, that university. So I went there as a grad student. And of course, it's a little bit like going to a rock concert and seeing your favorite performers, because I recognized either these people, what they looked like, or certainly their names, because I'd been reading about it for a long time. So I was a little bit starstruck. And I decided, again, that what these people are talking about in the presentation of their results is good science, but it's talking about stuff that like hardly anybody ever pays attention to. And the ones who do pay attention to it, they generally just dismiss it as nonsense. That's not what I saw. So anyway, so I joined the Parapsychological Association, and this was the first conference that I would have gone to. It was 1981. I presented the stuff that I was doing at Bell Labs, and I got a standing ovation. It was just simple little tests, and I was surprised because I figured, well, what am I doing that's any different than anybody else? It's the same stuff. Later, I learned it was because I was from a well-recognized laboratory doing this stuff within the laboratory, and everybody else, I guess, was feeling under the gun, or nobody was paying attention to them for many years in many cases, that they were all so happy with it. Afterwards, I got approached by people who were involved in the Stargate program, because they were at that conference too.
Can you tell people about the Stargate program?
I was what?
Oh, can you tell folks about what the Stargate program is?
Yeah. So this was 1981. From 1972 to 1995, there was a classified program run by various agencies that was doing psychic espionage. They were working with very talented remote viewers who were good enough to be able to work in military and intelligence missions. So there were rumors at the time that some strange program is going on, the government's doing something, but it was all at the rumor stage. But they approached me and said, if there was an opening, would you want to work on this project? Well, of course, that was an offer I couldn't refuse. So I went back to Bell Labs, and eventually there was an opening. If you can come here for a year, you could have this position. So again, I had to take that position. So I took a leave of absence from Bell Labs. I had been there at that point about 5 years. And at that point, it's not a sabbatical exactly, but you could take a long leave of absence. So I took a leave of absence and spent the calendar year 1985 at SRI International, which was the home base at the time for Stargate program. It wasn't Stargate then. The code names have changed over the years, depending on who was funding it and who was administrating the program and so on. But that was the program. So a year goes by, and I went back to Bell Labs. Apparently, nobody had ever come back from a leave of absence from Bell Labs, especially, I mean, it was in Silicon Valley, and, people would get attracted to there. But I did go back, and I went back partially because my wife at the time was in the insurance business, and Silicon Valley is not the place you want to be in the insurance business. She was an actuary. So I had to make a decision. Do I stay in this program, which was making me schizophrenic, because we were using a method which would uncover secrets anywhere in space or time, and nothing would be secret with these methods. And yet it was a secret program. So it was a classified program unveiling secrets, which it didn't feel right. We're doing something that is so mind-blowing that this is like something everyone should know about. I mean, really schizophrenic in the sense that you go into the building, into your office at SRI, and you're studying how mind is expansive throughout space and time in the universe. And we were working with very talented people who were demonstrating that on a daily basis. And then you go outside of the building, and you either completely denied it or you just didn't talk about it at all. And you're very well aware of what people were thinking about these things. And so that I imagine it would be similar today for people who may know more about UFOs or UAPs than they're able to talk about. I mean, if there truly are ETs among us, well, I would like to know that. Like, have a TV show and let's have an interview or something. But they can't talk about it. They know the interest is there, but they can't talk about it because you can't.
I actually just found a CIA document that was just recently declassified that talks about the threat of ESP to communication security, because this is from 1973, and they're very worried. They actually express deep concern that their communications cryptography is going to be broken by somebody with ESP. Particularly, they're concerned about the Russians at the time. But what's really an interesting gem here is that I won't read this to bore you, but anybody can find this. It's on actually the CIA's website. They actually say that the thing they're most concerned about is that the public is gaining interest in ESP, which is leading to the proliferation of studies of ESP. And they think that that's the problem. As long as people aren't, they say, look, it's a pretty rare thing. There seems to be some really convincing evidence of this. But as long as people aren't studying it, then no one will ever develop it. And therefore, it won't be a hazard to us. And that's the long and short of this, 100-page long document.
Yeah. That's true.
So I think that the downplaying of it is perhaps the least expensive way for them to minimize their security threat. But the fact that they're interested in it is just like, wow, right? It's like, well, if any, as soon as the government's taking something seriously, especially the Defense Department, which is arguably one of the most competent pieces of the whole machine, it's like there must be something happening here.
It's worse than suppressing the information. There's active disinformation as well. And so I can't prove this because I haven't found any evidence to this, but I kind of suspect that the rise of organized skepticism was encouraged, perhaps financially or some other way. And I'm talking about the James Randi kind of people out there who were just vigorously debunking everything to get their hands on, to make it both scientifically unacceptable to think about these things as real, to make fun of it, essentially, and to deflect attention. And so at the same time that all of that was happening in 1984, 85, maybe 86, the US Army had a program. Their motto at the time was "Be all that you can be," to recruit people. And so they had this thing called a program on enhancing human performance. So as part of the review of that, they had different areas said to enhance human performance. That included things like Hemisync methods and all the ESP research and a bunch of things like that. And so they had a government program brought together to review these things and see, well, what do we make of this? Like, is the Army spending its money wisely? And so in the review of ESP, the public press conference said that the strongest assessment of the things that they were doing or things that they were paying attention to was in the realm of ESP, where after 130 years, there wasn't any evidence at all that it existed. That was the public statement. That's not what their report actually said, but that's what was covered in all the media. But if you look into the report, and the reason why this is on my mind is because I was the president of the Parapsychological Association at the time, and I was at Princeton. So I was able to get a hold of anybody in the media I wanted to simply by calling them up and saying, "This is Dean Radin at Princeton. I want to talk with so-and-so." The response always was, "Yes, Dean." Initially thinking, they're being pretty familiar with me. And they think it's a title. Okay, I'll use it. Dean Radin. Yeah, I have a title. So
That's amazing.
that worked in the faculty club pretty well, too. I wanted to get a table at the faculty club. "This is Dean Radin. I would like a table." "Yes, sir." Anyway.
Makes me want to change my name.
So we read the report issued by the National Research Council, which did this review for the Army. And in the report itself, it said the Army should continue to monitor what was going on and maybe even fund some of the studies. And of course, that's not what the public heard. If they got the book and read it, they would have seen that. But so we wanted to investigate what's the disconnect between what the National Research Council said publicly and was widely distributed versus what they actually did. And so it turns out that to make sure that their assessment was correct, they got a guy named Robert Rosenthal, who was a methodology expert for research at Harvard. So he and a colleague looked specifically at the Gansfeld tests, which is one of the better known classes of tests for testing for telepathy. So they had them look at those experiments and say, well, what do you think of this methodologically? Are they done well? Are you persuaded by the data? And it was a completely positive report saying this is at least as good as some of the best studies in any other domain. And so we think this is actually quite good. That report, which is the same as the reports for all of the other consultants for this review, was suppressed. They didn't want to publish it. In fact, the head of the NRC committee called Robert Rosenthal and said, "We want you to drop this." Unfortunately, Rosenthal said, "I'm not going to drop it. You commissioned me to do it. That's what I said." So we learned that through talking to Rosenthal himself. And when the reporters then challenged the head of the NRC committee, why did you do that? And the answer was, well, we thought our conclusions were better.
So they basically recruited experts to look at the data. The experts look at the data and they say, okay, it looks good. And then the people in charge of the council overrule them. And when they put out the press release, completely contradict what the
Yes.
findings were.
Yes.
Was
There
there somebody
may-
specific at the NRC who did that? Or it was like a committee decision or?
It was the person in charge of that particular review committee
I see.
at the NRC. So he clearly had his marching orders. Your job is to deflect interest from this. Why? Because at exactly the same time, it was right in the middle of the Stargate program. So there was a lot of effort being taken that, at least from a public perspective, to say there's nothing going on here. Like, why bother? Don't even look at it.
How
We'd-
good were the people that you saw in the Stargate program? You say that they were being able to, look through space and time and see things. How good were they relative to who you found since? Was there a significant difference in skill?
There are people today who have that level of skill. Maybe they're still working for the military. I don't know. I'm not in that program anymore. The people back then the really good ones were naturally talented. They're like people who are natural psychics, but you would never have guessed that that's who they were, or that's what they were able to do. Some of them were found in the Army. So they were recruited through the Army by people who were asking the right questions, like, what is your background? What experiences do you have? And what do you think about telepathy? And all of those kinds of questions to kind of gauge, are they at least on the same wavelength? And then we're given performance tests, and some of them were exceptionally good. So what I think one of the reasons why there was exceptional performance going on in that is because of the motivational aspects of it. This is not like there were research programs that were going on, but a lot of it was operational. Like, there's a bad guy doing bad things over there. We need to figure out what's going on. Or there's a building and we don't know what this is, but we're a little bit afraid of it. Or there's drugs coming in the country and we're not quite sure where it is. Like, real life things that needed to be figured out. And the information that they got was probabilistic, like all of this information. But more often than not, it was able to give additional information to the intelligence analysts to allow them to create a picture which was more accurate, having the psychic information than not having it. And so in some cases were spectacular, but most of the time it was good enough to provide what analysts do, right? They pull in information from everywhere they possibly can and then try to create a story out of it that will hopefully match reality. Sometimes the psychic information was getting things that you could not get in any other way because we didn't have human intelligence on the ground. It was something that a satellite couldn't see. We were not able to get communications electromagnetically or otherwise. And so it proved to be useful information.
Do you remember any of these spectacular viewings?
Probably one of the better ones, the one that was strangest, because I learned all of this study after I got my clearances when I was working at SRI, which really blew me away because I knew about the rumors. I was now embedded within a group, but I needed to get clearances in order to get the briefing to bring me up to speed. So it took a long time, but I finally got that. So one of the cases ended up going to Congress because they thought that there was a leak, security leak. So one of the remote viewers was asked to, let me back up a bit. Because this is a controversial area and because even people within the military, they're not just handing out money, they hand it out by checking, vetting everything everywhere. So they would periodically say, we're going to do a test. We want you to tell us what's happening at this location. So they would choose a location. They knew what the answer was, but they wanted to see if the psychics could figure it out. So they give map coordinates for some place, in this case, somewhere in the Appalachian Mountains. Tell us what's going on in that map coordinate. So you figure, well, maybe somebody could get a hold of satellite information, but this was the mid 80s, and actually before that, it wasn't so easily available. We had spy satellites, but it wasn't like you can go to Google Earth and look there. That didn't exist yet. So the place that was selected by the contract monitor would be a cabin in the woods that happened to be this guy's cabin, and say, well, if I can pick up there's a cabin at this location and give some description of it, that would be kind of interesting. So the remote viewer that they chose, his name was Pat Price. he passed away. He said, yeah, there's like a cabin over here, but that's not very interesting. What's way more interesting is on the other side of this mountain. On the other side of this mountain, there's like a beehive of electromagnetic antennas, and it's cordoned off, and it seems like a secure location. So I'll go look at that. So he goes look into that, goes into a building, goes inside a safe in the building, inside folders inside the safe, and gets some code words. And then reports that. That's what is reported, because this is like the most interesting stuff that he is seeing. So they report back to the contract monitor, who freaks out because, in fact, it is a secret listening post. There is a safe, there is a building, their code words are correct. And the only way that they could think that was happening was that it was a leak. Somebody somewhere was leaking something, because how in the world could you else get that? So a congressional intelligence committee was formed to figure out what is the leak. So I wasn't there at the time, but my boss and the other people are telling me about this. They had to go to Congress, and they got grilled like we see on TV when people get grilled about things. They're saying, no, there is no leak. That's what these guys can do. So you can imagine then that information starts circulating within intelligence circles, and they get real interested in that, because now they're going to say, well, can you do that for the Russians? What about the Chinese? Yeah, it doesn't make any difference. So this program continued in this form for about 20 years, because missions were successful often enough to get that kind of information, which is otherwise completely unavailable, that they said, well, nobody understands exactly how they're doing it, but who cares? It's being useful for something. So much of these kinds of stories are enclosed in lots of books already from the people who actually did it. But the closest to what was actually going on at the time is in 4 volumes, 4 big fat volumes, large size fat volumes called Stargate Archives. So those 4 volumes were written by the director of that program from roughly 85 to 95, when the program shut down. And it's a lot of the original research documents, many of which were classified at the time. Lots of the internal documents showing people who knew things, like there were multiple scientific oversight committees. There were oversight committees for the research methods and for statistics and for on and on and on. I mean, outside experts brought in to do oversight on the research that was taking place. So
why do you think they shut it down? Did they shut it down and restart something else? Or is it just that in the era of digital communication, everything can be harvested?
Maybe they didn't shut it down.
Yeah. Did they shut it down?
Yeah, do you think?
As I said, my clearances expired long ago, so I don't know what's going on. But I would be disappointed if there wasn't some group or people or somewhere providing information of this type, because it is useful. And if you find people who are sufficiently talented, they can provide useful information. And nobody, just like in any intelligence operation, you don't rely on one source. Like when we do that, we end up in Iraq, right? I mean, there's examples of really bad decisions that are being made based on one guy. And so you always look for multiple sources of information. As we know in the case of Iraq, that there was political reasons for wanting to do this. So maybe they had intelligence, maybe they believed it, maybe they didn't, who knows? But decisions are made in technical and political environments that are partially rational, but then they're oftentimes overweighed by other things like economic reasons and otherwise. So my guess is that the reason why the program was closed is because for many years the DIA was controlling the whole thing. They got the money, they were now administering it, and people
Department
began to
of Internal
retire.
Affairs?
Excuse me?
The DIA is Department of Internal Affairs, or what is
No,
that?
Defense Intelligence Agency.
Okay.
All of these things
I'm
are
bad with
letters
acronyms,
the
I'm sorry.
agency at the end. Yeah. So like I didn't, when I first started with that, I didn't realize that MIA, we all know what that means. It also means Missile Intelligence Agency. There's 17 different intelligence agencies.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, some are known, some aren't known. Anyway, So the Defense Intelligence Agency had the oversight control of a big chunk of the Stargate program. For various reasons, the people retired, they got tired of it. So the money then, Congress allocates money, and then somebody has to take the money to actually do something with it in the whole military industrial complex. So the DIA didn't want it anymore, or the people retired and say, okay, somebody has to get it. Nobody's taking it. We want it to keep going. We're giving it to the CIA. Well, the CIA had a pretty significant problem at the time because I think it was the Eldridge Ames affair, where one of their major leaks that had happened. And so they didn't want anything to do with anything that was controversial because things leak even within that world. So they didn't want it. So they created this review, which effectively said, nah, it wasn't any good. We'll get rid of it. That gave the CIA a reason to say, we're giving the money back. We don't want to do this.
The NRC review. You're tying this back to the NRC?
This was a later review. This is called the American Institutes of Research, which is a private company like Rand Corporation. So they were charged by the CIA to do a review of remote viewing at SRI and later SAIC, which were the classified programs. They were given a limited amount of research to look at. They actually didn't look at most of it, but they got some of it. And they hired statistician Jessica Utz, who later became the president of the American Statistical Association, and Ray Hyman, who was a psychology professor long known for being highly skeptical about this stuff, and in fact wrote the leading argument within the Army's review. The argument that said 130 years and got no results. That's like his phrase. So they hired him to provide the con side, and Jessica to hire the pro side as the analyst of the actual data. So that report said that both of the reviewers agreed that what was going on here could not be explained by methodological problems, and there was a statistical anomaly in favor of remote viewing. Jessica said that if this were any other normal area, then this would already be accepted. So she accepted, remote viewing is real based on the evidence that we saw. Ray Hyman agreed with most of it, but said he didn't agree that it would be psychic because he didn't know what psychic was, so he couldn't say it was that. And this is one of the commentaries you see in skepticism where they actually use the phrase of there's no plausible alternative that they were able to identify, but I can't say it's telepathy or psychic because we don't know what that is. So I can't say that's what it is. So that has kind of a twisted logic to it. The sociologists use the term experimenters regress. And so the experimenters regress is, I'm studying to see whether X exists. And so we do lots of studies and we keep finding evidence for X. Now you give it over to a skeptic to say, well, did we find X? Their answer is, we don't know what X is. How can I say it's X if we don't know what it already is? Well, you can see it's a never-ending regression, because how can you establish that something exists if you don't know what it is to compare the evidence against it to say that's what it is? So it's like the perfect skeptical response because you never have to accept the evidence. So the only way you can begin to accept the evidence is if you have a theory that predicted that this should happen, because now you have an explanation. Even if the theory is wrong, you still have an explanation for it. You can say, oh, well, it's predicting that X should exist, and I did this experiment, and it's consistent with the theory, so that's what it is. And that's how things progress. If you're before theory, you're really stuck, because then there's no way to be able to answer that. So in that report, the two analysts, pro and con, both said, yeah, this is real stuff. We're not going to give it a name because we don't know what it is, but the evidence presented showed that it's real. However, we cannot say that it's useful pragmatically. Why? Because they didn't get the operational missions. They were given like research projects that were given, but not the details of the operational missions, because most of them were extremely highly classified, because you don't want people to know what you're targeting. So the report then comes out and is blasted over the media. CIA program says there's nothing to remote viewing. And so you want to see this, where you see this echoed is on Wikipedia, because Wikipedia is written by anonymous amateurs who have an axe to grind, apparently. So You go look on Wikipedia about the CIA remote viewing, you look at look at my own biography that I didn't write on Wikipedia, it's uniformly negative. And if I had to guess, I would guess that it's a holdover from many, many years of disenfranchising this as a viable topic. And so there are people, I doubt that they're being paid to do this, but like a lot of people, they become scientific after a while. And you say you begin to believe what you've been reading. If you're inculcated enough with lies, as we know that happens in the political world, you'll believe it because what else, you don't know what else to believe.
I like to call them bootlickers.
I missed the beginning of what you just said.
I said I like to call them bootlickers. Some people just love the boot.
Yeah, I guess it's some of that.
I mean, I guess I can have some sympathy for this as an intelligence project in that they seem very concerned that if this becomes popular and well studied, that somebody's going to use it against them. And so sometimes I have a hard time with the CIA because they seem to do all this evil stuff, but at the end of the day, I'm kind of like, maybe it's for the best. I don't know. You know, what you don't know, what you don't know, I guess is where I come down. And if it is genuinely a threat to national security, and you know, do you really want that to be something that you're encouraging? It's a fine line, right? It's tricky to condemn the intelligence agencies when we do live in the greatest country in the history of the world. So it's hard to look at our standard of living and not feel like we benefit wildly from the Central Intelligence Agency at the same time.
Turns out that Shiloh likes the boot more than I realized.
And another thing to add is I don't know anybody in the CIA, but I've known people who know people in the CIA, and the way that they describe how things get done in the greater sphere is through influence primarily. You throw a little bit of money at this, you put attention on something like, say, these skeptics, you give them a little bit of, you know, extra airspace, or you just sort of slowly kind of encourage things. And like you said, people have a tendency to roll with that, and they'll perpetuate it for many, many years, especially if it's something they grew up with. And ultimately, I think the idea that there are unexplained aspects of the natural world is deeply unsettling. Most of us come through high school science with this lovely, rosy idea that scientists have basically figured everything out and they're just filling in some details. And the reality, the deeper you get, once you do your PhD, you get really deep into science, you realize that couldn't be further from the truth. That we know way, how should I say this? We know way less than what we do know. We know there's much more we don't know than what we do know, especially the closer you look at anything.
What is it that Rumsfeld said? Like the unknown unknowns far outweigh the known knowns.
That was
Yeah.
twisting
The
me up.
known unknowns.
I like the quip from Terence McKenna on this, which is, as the bonfires of knowledge grow brighter, the more the darkness is revealed to our startled eyes.
Mm.
He had such a way with
People
words.
said more or less the same thing in lots of different directions. The more you begin to understand anything, the more you realize, holy smoke, I didn't know that. There's this much more. It's huge. So, yeah. So the thing about how the public would respond, you see the same thing being suggested now on government can't possibly reveal that there are ETs among us, say, because people would freak out. And in this particular case, we're talking about there are no secrets at all, including the sovereignty of your own thoughts, right? I mean, people are sort of paranoid about what the government's surveilling in anyway. I mean, I can say a phrase and my phone will wake up and my phone is listening all the time. Well, who else is listening? You know, I don't know. A lot of people maybe. So it is frightening to think that even what you might think of as being inside your head and locked away is not really as tight as you think. That's frightening to a lot of people.
It might be a
So
better
you just
world.
have to feed that fear, I think.
But it might be a better world to live in if everybody accepted that, right? I think that the cloak
Except
of...
for national defense.
But even national defense, if everybody operates under the paradigm of nothing being secret, then you have to figure out other ways of doing things. Perhaps diplomacy becomes far more important. Perhaps you're faced with the fact that you can't bluff your way through things, and maybe that's for the better. Like, it's hard for me to imagine a world where secrets are a net benefit. And I know that that's a
There's
really
bad
radical
guys, right?
perspective. I know there's bad guys, but if the bad guys aren't secret, then that's better for everybody to know. Like, I remember I had this conversation once with a friend where I was like, it's weird how cagey people are about their bank accounts. I'm like, why? Like, why are people so cagey about their finances? What would it change? And she's usually somebody who really likes to play with ideas, and it just really freaked her out. The idea that these sorts of personal details would get out into the open. And I've just never really fully understood that. Maybe I don't have enough to hide.
It's
Well,
because you're a Russian.
consider what would happen not only to the legal system, the whole justice system would radically change. Business would radically change. Everything about government would radically change. Interpersonal relationships would change. So I think I tend to agree with you that a civilization that is fully telepathic, in principle, ought to be much more stable and probably open, and one would hope compassionate and all the rest, than where we currently are. Because a lot of it is driven by you don't know what is going on for somebody else. This is one of the reasons why I think of the various intelligence agencies out there, I'm completely in favor of all of them. Because wars start when you don't know what's going on. You have reason to fear or be paranoid about somebody else, so you wouldn't need to get all of the information. But how do we get from here to there? That's the problem, right? How do we get from the way of civilization is currently constructed to one that is completely open like that? That
I mean, I
don't
think
know.
Neuralink might play a role, right? I think people are going to have the internet inside of their heads pretty soon. At least if Elon Musk has his way.
There's been really interesting studies recently. I don't know if you've seen them, where they're devising neural networks to be able to reconstruct visual images off of brain patterns.
Yeah.
And so you see something and you're hooked up to, I actually haven't read closely enough what they're looking at. It might be EEG information, might be something more invasive, but they can actually roughly reconstruct the picture that you're looking at.
Yeah, it's from functional MRI.
Which is crazy, because functional MRI is always viewed with a large asterisk among anybody who's actually studying it.
Patterns are good enough, right? You give deep learning to even very complicated patterns, and if it's consistent enough, you can pick it out, right? Because those are classification tasks.
Mm-hmm.
So here we're talking about something much, much, much worse, because it's no longer brain-computer interface stuff. It is not connected to you at all. People at a distance. What makes it much worse is it would transcend time as well. So in a civilization that had this really, really well down, they somehow figured out how to do telepathy and remote viewing, future, past, and present. That means that both past and future crimes, very much like Philip K. Dick's story about the Minority Report, that is a viability. I mean, I think that is actually possible. It raises all kinds of strange paradoxes and strange storylines and so on. But I think, given the research we already know about presentiment effects, unconscious physiological reactions to future events, that is not that far from where we currently are.
How trainable are these skills?
Not very, as best as we can tell. So part of the Stargate program was to figure out, why are these talented people so much better than people who are not talented? And they threw every psychological and physiological test that was known at the time. This is already 30 years ago, but none of them were able to discriminate very well. There were some personality characteristics that would identify within certain clusters of personalities, not significantly more than taking a Myers-Briggs and saying, if you fall within this one of 16 cells, which I happen to fall in, then you're at least likely to be interested in these things. You may not have any talent in it, but you're going to be attracted to it.
That's
But beyond that,
surprising.
we
That's
didn't know.
surprising to me, because I would think that there would be a specific. I would think it would be very close to emotional sensitivity. Like I feel like animals are often very sensitive to people's moods, especially if you have a dog or a cat or something. And I feel like this probably just goes to show how little I understand how this works amongst human beings. But it seems like it would be really emotionally sensitive people that would be good at this.
sometimes you could be too emotionally sensitive,
Mm.
right? So if you're highly empathic, one of the things that could happen is you suppress it because you're getting buffeted constantly by other people's pain.
I've seen
And so
that. Yeah.
you may be super psychic, but you'll never know it because you have pushed it down so far just to be able to live as a grounded human being. Because otherwise you end up with all kinds of disorders and simply trying to deal with it. What we do know then is, yes, there's some personality effects, some things like people who are engaged in creative living. So we're talking about artists, writers, dancers, musicians tend to do a lot better than people who are not in those creative professions or creative outlets.
It's really interesting.
That makes
It's
sense.
true that like in a Myers-Briggs sense, if you're an intuitive feeling type, you will do better on these than if you're sort of prototypical scientist, which is thinking analytical type of person. Analysis seems to get in the way. So that's why the artistic side seems to take over. So in the last couple of years, we started looking at the genetics, which wasn't available to really do any decent genetics back then because we didn't have the full genome yet. Well, now we do. So a couple of years ago, we started looking at whether or not there's a side gene. Maybe like a lot of things, there's differences in genetic underpinnings. So we were paying attention to the folklore that people are psychic in psychic families, sometimes for many generations. Like the women in this family, either every other generation or every generation, they're all super psychic. And of course, immediately raises the nature versus nurture issue. But maybe there's a genetic component. So we recruited people who said that they were psychic from psychic families, and we did a little bit of vetting to see if they were actually good at it. Got their DNA, they got their full genome, and then found controls to see if there's any genetic difference. So we did the best that we could.
Did you get any twins?
Excuse me?
Any twins in that lot?
No, we didn't see any. We didn't find any twins. It turned out to be not difficult to find people who said that they were psychic from psychic families. It turned out to be very difficult to find controls who said that they're absolutely not psychic, and no one in their family ever said that they were psychic. That was difficult, which already is telling you something. It's one of the reasons why in the general population, a lot of people had these experiences. So when we looked at the genomes, we found that there was one significant difference in an intron sequence, not a coding portion, but the epigenetic components, which used to be called junk DNA. So in an intron sequence, there was a difference, but it was the difference in the people who are the controls. Like we didn't find anything unusual in the rather simple techniques that we use to do the bioinformatics. It looked like the wild type, normal people, quote, normal people, those were the psychics from the psychic families. The mutants were the controls, which may have been why it was so much more difficult to find them. So if we had the money, and we only had something like $60,000 to do this, which wasn't enough, we'd want to look at thousands and thousands of cases and controls. And I kind of suspect that we would find both exome and intron sequences, but probably constellations of a lot of genes, constellations of genes, not just a gene, that would result in differences in talent. Things like differences in brain morphology and the connectome and all kinds of things like that.
The intron that you identified, was there any functionality that had already been mapped to it?
Yes.
What was the functionality?
It was involved in many things in the body. So that it wasn't like it's associated with intuition. It wasn't anything that simple. And anyway, as an intron sequence, it was essentially a genetic switch, right? It's turning something on or off in the genetic. Well, yes, you can look up in the atlas and find out what it does. It just seems to be involved in lots of things.
Well, this connects back to what you were saying earlier about LSD and the gating of perception, which it seems reasonable that if this is an ability that is innate to some degree, that those that would be better at it would be ungated in some way.
Yeah.
And so if it's a regulatory element and what it's doing is it's just tuning programs to filter perception.
Yeah, that's Henri Bergson talked about this as the filter theory. Yeah, so that the consciousness is somehow out there all the time, and your brain's a radio receiver, and it's filtering it out, it's tuning out most of it. And occasionally you're able to tune into something else, or maybe turn the tuner off completely. If you do that, as you probably know, if you take certain things like LSD, it feels like a flood coming in because you don't have the control anymore, and then it's overwhelming. That's why somebody, I think, as a complete speculation, that some people who end up very heavily drugged because of they're called schizophrenic or psychotic, they actually are natural psychics. They would do very well in a very controlled environment where they're not overstimulated. In this case, being not overstimulated is a little bit tricky because now this the entire universe, all throughout space and time, which could potentially be impinging on them. Of course, how do you shield from that? We have no idea how to shield. We don't know anything that blocks it. So no wonder they go crazy after a while. They can't turn it off. But that's like full blown. But you take somebody who's like pretty high up on the schizotypy scale, not full blown psychotic, but also like creative artist plus a little more. We're really open to these things, but still have enough control to be able to turn it on and off. And it turns out that in a sense is the true experts that we can find. They can go into some space. It just blasts in there. And by the way, it's not like their mind is going out and looking around and everything. It comes in, boom, it's all there. And so the training, remote viewing training, is to figure out, once you have this flash of a huge amount of information, how do you decompose it? How do you pull it apart to try to make any sense of it? That takes a lot of training to be able to do that. But you need the talent in the first place to be able to deal with what it feels like to get all of that in one lump.
That
some people
seems
are
to be
good
the
at that and
perennial.
others are not so good.
It's the perennial problem with psychedelic experiences too, is that people have a really hard time bringing their acquired wisdom, back to the real world.
Yeah.
But by the way, I love the image, or I love the definition of artist as schizo adjacent. That checks out. And I mean, being an artist myself, I feel like, especially a musician, and having dealt with many musicians over the course of my life, it's always a little bit of craziness involved, and I think that's necessary. But it's really funny to hear it clinically put.
My first career track was being a concert violinist.
That's
right.
right.
So I did that for 20 years. That's what I thought I was going to be when I was growing up, because I was good at it. And I'm somewhat convinced at this point that, especially for a stringed instrument, that it's a type of a meditation. You're doing many things at the same time, and you have to concentrate a lot when you're at least the beginning stages. So I have something like 20,000 hours of practice doing that. So, of course, there's no control group here. I don't have an identical twin who didn't do that, so I have no way to be able to tell. But at least within my family, so I have a brother who became a dentist and also a drama coach in the high school for many, many years. My dad was a sculptor. That's how he made his living. My mom was a homemaker until we were grown up, and then she worked as an occupational therapist on a psychiatric ward of a hospital.
Oh, wow.
Oh, that's intense.
Kind of similar to raising children in some ways.
What? I didn't hear that.
Oh, I said it's kind of similar to raising children, working on as an occupational therapist for a psych ward.
Yes, yes, with psychiatric patients. Yeah, it's true. Maybe she learned it from us. I don't know. But anyway, so I was the only one that was very interested in this area very early on. Like I'd read books about meditation. I was trying to do meditation after reading about it in a book, which doesn't exactly work so good. But this was when I was 15 or something. So again, there's just predilections that children have, even very young children, that you can see, well, that one's going to be a philosopher, and that one is going to like swim in a pool all day long or something,
Have you ever played music in an improvisational setting before?
No. You see, so
because that's one of the closest I've ever been to sensing something close to ESP, which is when you really get to know, especially if you're with people you're really close with. But honestly, you can do it with complete strangers too. But sometimes you'll just lock into this space where you really feel like
You can anticipate the changes that are going to come next. We would do
there's
this.
like a Ouija board too, right? People are making collective decisions without talking. It's very, very, very adjacent.
When we lived in Portland, there was this incredible thing called the Portland Synth Improvisers Collective. And the way that it would work is that we would gather after hours at a coffee shop, and everybody would bring some kind of synthesizer. And each table would have a mixer that everybody would plug into, and you'd wear headphones. And so you'd make this improvisational piece of music together for 20 minutes, and then everybody would shuffle.
In silence.
In silence. Like, it's totally silent in the room, but the experience is in the headphones. And occasionally you would have a group of people that just were able to anticipate changes and hear each other before anything happened.
There would be tears sometimes, you know, it was really, really profound sometimes.
Never experienced anything like that.
Yeah. So I can talk about our collective consciousness studies, which is common in musical groups and choral groups and things like that. It happens. And in that case, it's happening without psychedelics. So, I mean, at least what we're learning now in hyperscanning studies, when people are engaged in the same task, that their brains go in sync if they are actually engaged in the same task. So if you have two people or more than two people watching the same video, their brains will go into sync. And you can tell who's not in sync because their bodies are not showing the same synchronization. So this is way back in graduate school, I got interested in body synchrony. And you could tell by taking a video of people sitting around a table of who was paying attention to what was going on by whether or not their bodies were swaying in synchrony. And so we all are familiar with, even on Zoom, you see this sometimes, that there's a bunch of people out there and one of them then takes a drink, or one of them moves slightly, or one of them does something. Everyone will do it at exactly the same time. Well, why? Why does that happen? It happens in person more often because there's more sensory information coming in, but that level of synchrony is happening constantly. And that's how you can tell when somebody's not paying attention, because they're moving to some other thing going on in their own head or somewhere else. Yeah.
I mean, I think hypnotists and like con men and stuff use this to their advantage to some extent, right? The behavioral mirroring in conversations. It's actually like a bona fide interviewing skill to get someone to be comfortable with you, is to just mirror their body language to some extent.
Yeah, really good used car salesmen are good at that too, right?
It's funny when you start noticing it, though.
Well, it's amazing though. I mean, if you meet somebody in a sales room and you feel like they're a long, fast friend in about 2 minutes, that is a skill.
Get out of there.
Yeah, like I can't tell you how many times I went in to have oil changed in a car and left with a new car. Because, well, what are you doing? You're waiting for the oil to get changed, and meanwhile you're looking at the new cars. Oh, look at that! And so the questions start coming up. Well, how old is your old car? And you think, have you ever thought about getting a new car? It would be so easy to get a new car. And then you leave and say, holy crap, what had happened? But I don't know what happened here, but it did.
I love that.
Hey guys, quick interruption. Remember, this program is entirely supported by people listening like you. I just got another email today where somebody wants us to sell vitamins for them, and I really don't want to ever have to go down that road. But that means that we need to get your support over at patreon.com/demystifysci. We have a really cool crew coming together once a week where we get together over Zoom, chop it up about what's happening on the podcast and what we should be exploring next. And I'd love to see you there. So check out patreon.com/demystifysci and enjoy the rest of the conversation.
I had a couple of questions about things that you had mentioned previously that I wanted to return to. And then I think it would be interesting to talk about where the research is going next and future directions. And so one of the topics that we talked about before the break was we were talking about training, and you were sort of skeptical about there being really good methods. But you mentioned the Hemisync methodology, and I know that that was very popular for a while. Could we talk a little bit about what it is and what it works for and what it doesn't work for?
Yeah, so Hemisync is a binaural beat method, at least the initial version. Now they're into something else. It creates a sound that may be a frequency of, say, 400 hertz in one ear and 410 in the other ear. And so what you listen to in stereo is a beat sound that's 10 hertz. And the idea is that it would help entrain your brain to go to that frequency. So you can imagine a program that may start out at, say, 15 hertz, roughly in beta kind of rhythm, and slowly keep moving down so that you're pushed into theta or below even. And so when you go, you can just listen to those tapes, and some people have pretty strong response to it. But in their gateway program, which is one of the first entrees into this method, I took a week-long workshop where you would listen to those tapes around 10 hours a day. So like during the morning, and then there'd be a break, and then there'd another long stretch, and then you'd have lunch, and you'd wake up to it, and you'd go to sleep to it. So you're getting a lot of that.
Are you doing anything else while you're doing it, or you're just listening?
Just listening. It's hard not to listen because you have headphones on, and everyone is listening to a broadcast version of it. So you're all listening to the same tones at the same time. At the beginning of the workshop, the trainer said, you're going to get really altered by this because you don't have any other responsibilities, and you're doing this for 6 days in a row, and you're getting it 10 hours a day. And I'm thinking, yeah, right. Like I've done all kinds of meditations and stuff, and I know what it feels like. So we go through it all, and people are then describing their experiences, and I tend to be pretty analytical during these things, and probably avoid dropping deep because more often than not, I'm Mr. Scientist in the group. And so I feel a certain pressure to maintain that role. So I'm pushing it. So we get to the end of that, and now I'm driving home, and they say, you probably don't want to drive home because you are more altered than you think. I said, no, I feel perfectly fine. A, I have no memory of driving home, but I got home by driving. B, the first thing I remember, like I was leaving the thing, the first thing I remember is several miles later where I've stopped at a red light, the first traffic light that they get to on the way home. So I'm stopping at that light, and I remember thinking while looking at the light, that is the most beautiful color red I have ever seen. That is such a good looking red. And then it changed and it was green. And I thought, that is a really good looking green. I like that green. I had no idea that I was supposed to do anything until people behind me started hitting their horns. And I realized, I think I'm supposed to do something. And then I saw cars moving and said, oh, right. Okay, I'm moving now. The next thing I remember was I'm home. Years later, I realized that I had one of the other participants in the car with me. She had gone through the same process. And the reason why I was going home this way is to drop her off at the bus station, which I did. And I have no memory of any of that, which is really frightening in a sense. I was so altered that somehow my body took over and was able to drive, even though I was kind of floating. I like whatever I am wasn't quite there at that time. So even though I was being Mr. Scientist at the time and trying to be analytical about it, nuh-uh. You listen to these kinds of things long enough, and like you certainly would learn in a meditation workshop that you get very seriously altered. So in that sense, yes. Will that improve psiability? Yes, because it'll start dropping all those filters. The question is, does it train? And there we're not so sure. So there have been a few studies with short, long, and very long-term meditators to see if they do better. The answer is yes. The more meditation is correlated with better performance, but there's a confound in that people who stay in the meditation for very long periods of time, they're getting something out of it, which may have nothing to do with psi. So maybe it's correlated, and maybe it's sort of a secondary effect, and we don't really know. Like they were already psi talented to begin with, and that's correlated with something else. So it's very difficult to say that you can definitely train to get better. However, one of the reasons why remote viewing has become very popular is because it is a training technique. And the training technique, to a large extent, is You close your eyes, you imagine what the picture is going to be that they're going to show you 2 hours later, and then you figure out what do I do with that information? Even if you're not very visual, you'll get something. So what do you do with it? Well, there's a training procedure to go through so that you don't name the impression. You don't give it a name immediately. You learn to sketch, and then the sketch gets more complicated, and so on. So that you can learn. And then that way you can get better in the same way that if you had never watched anybody play tennis before, but you knew it had something to do with a ball and a racket, and then you have to get it over, you read about it, but you didn't really know. So you could be playing, you say, this is really hard, I'm not getting any good at this. And now you go to a teacher and say, can you help me figure out what to do? So they say, well, the first thing you should do is not hold the racket on the big side. Hold it on the small side, and then you have this big round thing that you can do to hit the ball. So that's like a first tip. And you start doing that, you say, holy smoke, this is a lot easier now that I'm hitting it the right way. And think about a number of tips and tricks like that would help you get better. So like any talent or any skill that you learn, people will asymptote to different degrees and also get to that point quicker or slower. So everyone has a certain level that they'll get to, and the speed with which they get to it, that's where talent comes into play. So yes, you can learn tips and tricks and get better, but the ones that are really, really good learn very quickly and asymptote really high. No different than anybody in the Olympics, right? I mean, when kids are doing things in school, really good coaches will see right away, this kid has talent. That kid better go into economics or something, because it's just not going to work.
What about pharmacological shortcuts? Has there been
Yeah.
any evidence that you can give people chemical assistance to heighten their abilities?
Many, many stories that if you take the right thing under the right circumstances, you will be telepathic. You will have remote viewing type visions. Again, it's difficult to separate the distortions, especially with hallucinogenics. The distortions can be flagrantly psychic, but very difficult to piece apart to know which part of it was real, what's not real, all the rest of it. So yes, it definitely pushes in that direction, which is why when people ask me, well, what would I do if I wanted to be trained? Meditate. Probably doesn't matter too much which style. I personally like Vipassana, but that's just me. And then learn about the tips and tricks, or take a remote viewing training course. Will you be better than you currently are? Yes. Will you continually get better until you're the world's best psychic? Probably not.
Are the tips and tricks something that is a manageable list of things, or is it just...
Yeah.
What are they?
You did this, Nastya.
I did do
Yeah,
this.
Nastya did a remote viewing course, actually. One of our patrons demanded that she do it, and he paid for her to take this very expensive course.
The Silva method. Have you heard of it?
Oh, yeah. That's not exactly remote viewing, but yeah, I know the Silva course.
So it had a remote viewing I don't know if if calling it remote viewing is accurate or not. So basically, it was very similar to what you're describing about listening to these tapes, because there would be these moments of everyone in the course listening to a very weird sound in order to trigger you into this theta state. And then after several days of, I think it was 4 days long, and so each day was it was a little bit deeper. And the first very weird thing that happened is that we were doing these substance meditations where you had like 4 different substances, like something made out of metal, something made out of glass, something made out of plant material. And so you would go into this meditation and you would focus on all of these objects. And then the last one, the direction was to focus on an animal. And so I focused on my cat, and as I'm doing the meditation, I'm thinking about her, I'm visualizing her, I have this weird sensation in my left eye. It looks like there's a light that's shining in it. And I'm like, that's really weird. I open my eyes and there's nothing that's changed in the room. I'm not sitting anywhere where something could have glinted at me. And then we have a break and I walk into the kitchen and the cat comes in from the outside and I can see she's got something stuck in her left eye.
Mm.
And I was like, that's really weird. But so we continue, and then the last day of the course is they do this thing where they have a selection of patients, where you're given a description, a very minimalist description of the patient, and you're supposed to go into this remote viewing state and imagine them and then figure out what's wrong with them, and
Right.
also figure out if you can come up with a physical description of them. And it was weird because I was able to come up with a physical description of the person and the physical ailments that they had, not in like a specific sense, but there was, like a little girl.
Like they had a stomach ache or something.
That was exactly the thing. Like there was one of them was like a little girl, and I'm like imagining her, and the direction is that you kind of like run your hands over the imagined body and figure out where the pain is. And I was like, she's got a stomach ache, and she had some kind of like gastrointestinal problems. There was another guy where I couldn't figure it out, and I was like, I think he's just got this like weird sense that everything's wrong. And it turns out that he had depression. And I was like, that's really weird, and I don't know what to do with it. And it just kind of, it happened, and I just filed it away in the filing cabinet of things that I can't possibly understand or explain. And so, and I don't know if it was the training or it was the meditation or if it's something that's innate, and I haven't been able to classify or catalog it in any way.
Yeah, all of the above. Right. The other thing is given permission. You're given permission to do this because, especially for scientists, we're told so many times in so many different ways that this is somewhere between impossible and crazy. And so you need permission in the right context with a bunch of other people who don't appear to be acting crazy to simply dissociate from your doubt. Right? It's like you drop your skepticism when you go to a movie. Otherwise, why bother? Well, it's very much like that. So when people then say, well, my skepticism is so high when trying to do something like a magical act, spell casting or something. I say, well, why do you go to superhero movies? You're not watching Wolverine and saying, well, that you couldn't do that. I mean, you would hurt your hand to do that. No, you suspend disbelief. You consciously do that. And one of the ways that a scientist can do that in particular is to say that, well, an hour from now, it'll all come back. Like I'm not going psychotic at this point and making it all go away, I'm making a conscious decision, as I could do many kind of decisions. And this particular one, I am suspending my disbelief that this is possible. And so for the X period of time next, it is perfectly possible. Not only possible, I can do it. And so it's permission to yourself, permission coming from the environment and all the rest of it makes a huge difference. And in that case, as you saw it, you don't need psychedelics to make it happen. It just happens.
But I think that the meditating for extended periods for several days in a row was a really key aspect of it, because it was hours of it for 4 days that I'd never done before and I haven't done since. And I could tell that it was very, very different after those 4 days. And it fades, right? Because it's this momentary state that you elevate yourself into, and then the rest of life creeps in and it's somewhere floating around.
Everyday waking state is the worst possible state in which to do psi performance. Yeah, every other state, almost every other state you can get into is better than the everyday waking state.
That's really interesting.
It's interesting though, doesn't seem to be a magic bullet. I'm sure not for lack of trying, right? Different agencies must have been very interested in finding a drug that could emulate this state. Sorry, we just had a weird noise in our.
Yeah, did you hear that?
No.
Okay.
I think it's gone.
Yeah, it's gone now.
Yeah. So there are people interested in coming up with a magic bullet. But I asked my boss one time, if we did come up with something like that, what would happen to it? And the answer immediately was it would go down a black hole and you'd never be able to talk about it again. I figured, well, what are we doing then? I mean, what are we working on here? If we discover something that would change the world forever, and then you can't talk about it. So I have great sympathy for people working on classified programs, because especially scientists, because they're in it because of the curiosity to discover something amazing, and then say, well, sorry, you can't talk about it. So it's a pity. Well, so this is why I think that the Psi Genes project, which we are still doing, the latest version of what we've been doing is we go to 23andMe and we see that there's not a very good, but some genome that you can get. It's mostly exome. So we recruited people who took 23andMe, asked them to download their data, and then to take questionnaires to ask about a bunch of different kinds of psychic things. And then we used machine learning to look at the correlations between them, trained on a bunch and then test on a bunch of others, a classification learning algorithm. And we found a number of exomes that are involved in different kinds of ways that people experience psychic things. So that gives us additional confidence that if we did this properly, we had millions of dollars and test huge numbers of people and do RNA-seq and other more sophisticated methods, we would almost certainly find that there's a cocktail that would do this. And so one of the other things I'm involved in, partially as a result of this line of research, was I co-founded a genetic neuroengineering company. So we can do with an intranasal spray, we can do either CRISPR or RNA methods, RNA interference methods, and change receptors. We can downregulate, we can silence receptors in your brain very precisely, including cocktails, which we haven't developed cocktails yet. We're just targeting like 5-HT2A. We can turn that off. We can do it temporarily, we can do it permanently. And we're pretty sure at this point that if we found that, I don't know, a half a dozen receptors tweaked in just the right way would put you into that state after what feels like after meditating for 8 hours, for 10 days, we could probably put you into that. The problem is we can't get you out very quickly. You know, when you start monkeying around with receptors, you're talking about changing proteins in the brain. So we can do that. We're targeting things like dementia and Alzheimer's, because we know by twiddling certain receptors, you can significantly improve memory. And we've shown that in mice and rats. So we figured, yes, someday there will be a nasal spray, probably with RNAi or some other faster acting genetic edit that will make you super psychic for a couple of weeks before it wears off. But then even if it was a couple of weeks, well, what does that person do during then? I mean, not only that, but we're still struggling with, we know it works in mice and rats. Well, next step is non-human primate. I'm not a member of PETA, but after thinking about what we would be doing to these non-human primates, monkeys, I'm not sure I want to do it. But we have to do it if we wanted to make an actual treatment. So I'm still having an ethical issue about this. And, you know, we could potentially help a lot of people who are facing dementia and Alzheimer's, but at the cost of a dozen macaques or something. They're very intelligent creatures, so I don't know what to do.
It reminds me of something I wanted to ask you earlier, which is, what is the quality of life of people? There was somebody you mentioned in this anecdote earlier about the Stargate Project. I believe, was it Philip something?
The really talented,
yeah, the really
remote
talented
viewer.
remote viewer. Yeah, what is that person's life like outside of doing these projects? Are they trying to play the stock market? Like, do they make use of this, or is it just this?
He was a police commissioner for Burbank, California.
Oh, wow.
So he became very, very good at what he did because he could see what was going on. So wild. Yeah, he was unusual in the sense that he was very talented at this particular thing, but very well grounded at the same time.
You know, it makes me also think of, have you heard of Philip Tetlock's work on super forecasting?
Yes.
Have you looked into recruiting any of the super talented forecasters for this kind of stuff? Because it seems very sci adjacent. They're always people that you wouldn't expect. I think one of the best forecasters, like a plumber in Iowa or something like that.
Yeah. Yeah, we thought about it, but we can't do everything.
Sure, right. Of course. So before we close, you mentioned very briefly this idea of controlled opposition, and you mentioned James Randi. And I can also think of people like Michael Shermer. There's like a whole constellation of super skeptics.
Yeah.
Do you think that they play a valuable role at all?
Well, yes and no. So the yes part is that I think it's important for people to realize that a lot of what passes for psychic isn't. And so they're constantly showing that, right? Nobody wants to be scammed because some psychic says something and then you give them all your money or something like that. So yes, fraud does take place many times by people who are making believe that they're psychic. No question about that. So is that valuable to know? Yes. It is not valuable in the sense that typically the critiques don't discriminate between scientists who are trying to understand these things versus people who are out to prove that psychics, meaning like somebody who puts up a shingle somewhere, that's not what we do. So I am constantly getting emails from people who think that as a parapsychologist, I can help them psychically. So that's why I put in my bio on my website, I am not a psychic. I'm not a therapist either. I'm a scientist. I study these things. It's not stopping the emails. People just desperately want help or to figure out something. So it's the lack of discrimination between people who say they're psychics. Some of them may well be real, like they can really do stuff. A lot of them aren't. So yes, it's valuable to be able to make that discrimination. And one of the reasons why, by the way, when people will sometimes say I'm involved in the paranormal, what does that even mean? It's like everything you've ever seen on the X-Files is the paranormal. It's all weird stuff gets shoveled into one bin. And so I make a distinction. The psi research is very different because it is completely amenable to scientific study in the laboratory under controlled conditions and has been for the last 150 years. So we can gain certain degrees of confidence with it that we can't do so well with Bigfoot because he won't come into the laboratory. And I've seen bits and pieces of evidence now and then that look kind of interesting, but if it's only anecdotal or in some respects, even like what we see with UFOs, there's some intriguing stuff out there. But at least to gain high confidence that something's real, has to be independently repeatable. You want to get it under some type of control, even if it's a very small magnitude effect. The other thing that sometimes is not well described to people, especially lay people, is that something can be real, and yet the magnitude of it could be really, really tiny. You can gain very high confidence in very tiny things. So one of the ways of illustrating that is to say, well, we know the charge on the electron, and we know it out to like 10 decimal places, but it's like to minus 10 to the 19th or something in terms of coulombs. Well, you would never, ever be able to detect that yourself. We have instruments that can do it, but it's pretty sophisticated. Well, then why should I care about that? Who cares what that is? Well, you care because there are now hundreds of trillions of terawatts that are running the world. It took us 200 years to get there from this thing that Benjamin Franklin was studying. And we're kind of at that stage now. We know these effects are real. They tend to be really tiny in the laboratory, but we have very high confidence that they're also real. Will that ever turn into very pragmatic things? And so I say, yes, it potentially can do that. But the civilization that we would have at that point would look so different from what we have today that you would not recognize it at all. Totally different, completely different justice system. It would be like, it wouldn't have any comparison to what we see today. You may not even need police anymore. You don't need any of that apparatus. And business and everything else, politics would be totally different. I mean, just imagine now the way politics go, where there's alternative facts. You know immediately one of two things. This guy's lying, or this guy actually doesn't know that he's lying. You can do a consensus at that point. You just like put out your telepathic feelers and say, well, what is the consensus view about what's going on here? And you still may not know the answer because in a lot of cases, we really don't know what's happening, where you can gain like a collective consensus, in which case you can say, well, that guy believes what he's saying, but he's also delusional because that's not what 99.99% of everybody else is thinking. And some of them, at least, we have a sense that they're pretty confident for these reasons. So yeah, things would look very, very different. That's why I think I like the idea of taking what we learn and moving in that direction, if we can get past our rough adolescence. But I don't know how we get from here to there without lots of gnashing of teeth and people saying bad things about other people. But I think
I mean, it
that's
might be on evolutionary timescales. It's hard to say. Like
yes.
I often, we were talking. I forget who we were talking with the other day, but I'm trying to imagine the moment when humans first developed the story and first really developed the ability to transmit information to each other in the abstract. Did that occur over one generation, or did that occur very piecemeal over millions of years? It's very, very difficult to say. But I'm intrigued by the possibility that it could happen very quickly also. So
Well,
we
we
do
know that
see,
social taboos can collapse quickly. It appears to collapse quickly, even though behind it has been an enormous amount of pressure for a long period of time. So it does seem to be something like a step function. There's a lot of pressure and pressure and pressure, and then some criterion is reached, and boom, it flips into the other direction. So that, yes, that can happen.
I mean,
It
that'd be
may
a
happen
beautiful
in this
world.
case too.
I hope so. It's funny, at the beginning of the conversation, you mentioned, if we make it another 1,000 years or something, because, hopefully nothing will destroy us like an AI takeover. And I think I'm more worried about partisan politics destroying the world than the artificial intelligence,
Yeah,
at least from the AIs that I've worked with. They seem less dangerous.
yeah, that was just one of many existential crises that we face that I could have mentioned. Yeah.
So what are you working on next? What does your horizon look like?
Well, what I've been working on for about the past 15 years is trying to make a bridge between these kinds of phenomena and what is of interest in mainstream physics, primarily the quantum observer effect. Because the quantum observer effect is suggesting that there's some element of consciousness that is involved in the fabric of reality. That's a minority position within physics today, but it was a majority position when quantum mechanics first began. So again, we have these cycles of what people think they want to believe in. So to do that, in 1998, we had some colleagues, one at York University and the other at Princeton University, who used a double slit optical system to see if through ESP you could gain which path information about the path of the photons as they went through the double slit. Because if ESP is real, you should be able to gain information, and that would be enough to collapse the wave function. And that would be like a direct way of testing if consciousness collapses the wave function, which as von Neumann and lots of others had said. So the guy at York University got a non-significant result, and the guy at Princeton did get a significant result. Well, this is like completely revolutionary, and nobody did anything about it for the next 10 years for a good reason. Psychologists don't know what to do because they don't work with optical physics, and physicists don't want to consider that consciousness has anything to do with what physics is about. So there's nobody left. Well, starting in 2008, I decided, well, that's an interesting strategic move from a scientific perspective, because it is a way of addressing an outstanding puzzle in physics that would really change a lot if it was shown that these experiments can inform an outstanding and unsolved problem in quantum mechanics, namely to do with the interpretation of whatever that's trying to tell us. So I first did an experiment with a Michelson interferometer, and then from 2012 until 2022 or something, we did another 18 or so experiments with a double slit system. And so we started publishing our stuff. We had some physicists visit us. One of them went back to the University of Sao Paulo in Brazil and did a replication and also found interesting results. And so we all publishing our things. And then colleagues said, oh, there's another group that replicated this at the University of Serbia. I never heard of it before, but I looked it up, and sure enough, there's the article published, and they found exactly what we had found. I mean, they even mentioned that Professor Radin found this, and we found that too. I thought, okay, that's good. Then last year, there was a review of all of these double slit studies by a group at the University of Ireland in Galway, National University in Ireland. And they concluded, after looking at all of it, that it looks like some aspect of consciousness interacts with the physical world. So some sort of mind-matter interaction effect. So I would say then that what we've shown so far should be intriguing. It's not going to convince anybody, because at this point, only 5 labs, 4 of which show something interesting. You need a lot more than that to be able to make a revolution. So what I've been doing most of last year and doing right now is creating a replication package, which is an optical interferometer, and I provide the hardware and I provide software, and I find people who can do it, who are willing to do it, to run other people in it and to do the experiment properly. The version I'm working on now will be part of the Internet of Things. So when they plug it in on their side, the data is streamed up to a server and it's very secure and everybody can check it and it's open and transparent and all that. So one grant is going to create 4 such packages and another grant would create 10 packages, each one of which would be an independent replication, and to give them confidence that they're working with a real system, it's all completely open. Software is written in Python and all the scripts are there and the same, I give pictures of the printed circuit board and the components and everything. If they want to start from scratch, they're welcome to it. So that's what I'm working on now. It's because it became very clear after a while, not just in our lab, but other labs, that we could do this until we're blue in the face. And it's not going to reach the threshold where enough people have seen it firsthand, where they start to say, oh, that might be real. And the reason why I'm doing this is because I remember very clearly what it was like when I was at Bell Labs doing this. One part of me is thinking, this is bullshit. Like I have the 20% time where I can do stuff and I have this fancy random number generator, but I can't let on to my colleagues that it's bullshit. Otherwise they wouldn't do the experiment. So I had to make believe like this could be real. Let's try it. Let's see what happens. They just did it because they were being nice or they were bored or something. And it turned out that it was real. And it took years for me to go through that exercise, continually questioning this doesn't make any sense. Because at that point, I didn't even have a philosophical basis for understanding why this might be real. I was thinking there's still some kind of, I don't know, a kind of electromagnetic force beam coming out of my head or something to do this, because that's all I could think of at the time. But after working through all of that, one day I was complaining to a colleague about this, saying, well, I can't even imagine how this could work, seeing that it's working statistically. And he said, well, that's your problem. What do you mean? You can't imagine it. Your imagination has stopped you from being able to even consider that it might be real. And then it's like, ding, oh, I can stop myself from even imagining that something is real, even though we're doing it empirically. It's working somehow. So there are a number of little insights like that happened over the years, where it gives me enormous sympathy for people who will listen to these kinds of things and say that's bullshit. That can't happen. To which I add like a little ellipsis after that and saying, in a particular form of philosophical assumptions, it cannot happen. And yet it does happen empirically, which means that some of those assumptions are not right. And 100% of assumptions are never right, right? Reductive materialism is really, really good, but it's a special case. There's more to the world than that. And so if you leave it as a special case, we don't have to change any of the textbooks. That was the big fear in my academic colleagues. Said that what you're doing cannot be right because we'll have to throw away all the textbooks and start over again. Which I respond, no, actually we don't. We do what we do in every scientific discipline. You see that something which you thought was fundamental is actually a special case and it works in these conditions, just like classical mechanics and quantum and relativity. It's a special case. That's, I think, what is going to happen here. We'll become more and more comprehensive in our terms of what we think reality is. Materialism is not going to go away because it's way too effective for that special case.
And so do you think that you've hit upon a theory that allows people to see that X is happening and wrestle with that result on its face?
At this point, not so much a theory as much as a door has opened a crack. Like we still there's a dozen interpretations of quantum mechanics, right? Mathematically it works really good, but we don't know how to understand it. But the important thing is that a door has opened. So people who say that violates physical law are simply wrong. It doesn't violate physical law. We don't have a good explanation for why that is, but that door's open and it's not going to close at this point. So I try to remind people by saying, look, you can look through that door and they're looking at my hand. Don't look at the hand. It's through the door that we need to look. And some point we're going to get through that. And we're going to end up with a nonlinear form or some other multidimensional quantum mechanics or whatever. where within that context, not only will the mathematics predict these things, but it will almost certainly have to include something like mind or consciousness as a component. Maybe all it is that the Born rule has to be tweaked a little bit. So you have the Born rule, which is, of course, central to quantum mechanics. There's an extra little variable next to it. There's some delta epsilon or something next to it, which has to do with intention and the mind. That would account for almost all of this stuff right off the bat. And so that's not even changing current quantum mechanics very much. It's just saying, well, we forgot that actually the equation, you need this extra little piece. Most of the time it's averaged out and nobody knows about it, but not when you're actually intending to look at it. So it'd be similar to saying, let's go back 40 years ago and say, well, nobody was seeing a Higgs boson. That's because they weren't thinking about looking for it. You have to go looking for it and have a reason for looking for it to see that, equation actually needs a next little bit more. I think that's the route that's going to happen in the short term. The longer term, it's going to be way more radical than that, much different than that. But that's how you get from here to there without causing the world to explode.
It seems like it wouldn't be that big of a leap for physicists to consider mind-matter interactions because they're so comfortable with completely spooky actions at a distance. I mean, gravity itself, right? I mean, sure, you can model it as space-time warping or something like that, but this is quite a poetic analogy to describe the phenomena as we observe it at the end of the day. The reality of the fact is that something's holding the Earth to the sun, and that's really, really bizarre. But we're all totally comfortable with it at the same time. We're like, yeah, well, it just happens. And it seems like people have forgotten how bizarre that is, I suppose. I mean, the scientists, if they're unwilling to consider that there might be other stuff like that that's equally unexplained. And even though we don't have the predictive models, I think the hinge point, obviously, is that we can very predictively describe how gravity behaves. And in the case of a lot of this research, it's very difficult to predict who's going to achieve and what they're going to achieve. Not so much that it happens, it's just the unpredictability of it that I think scientists are probably deeply uncomfortable with.
Yeah, especially in physics, because physics is not supposed to pay attention to consciousness or mind. It's not part of the discipline. So in the academic world, it's very difficult to deal with anybody else outside your tiny little slice. And so this is not just adjacent silos. This is a silo on the way on the other side of the campus that you don't deal with it. So that's one of the reasons why you get this prejudice. And it's persistent for at least 500 years. Many, many generations of students have been taught this is what we do. But go back to the Nobel Prize a couple of years ago for the folks who got it for entanglement. When Clauser first started doing that test to see if I forget if it was electrons or photons were entangled, he was told, don't do this, because even testing quantum fundamentals was not considered part of physics. Like, you won't get your doctorate if you do this. Well, he did it anyway because he was curious. Nevertheless, it's that kind of prejudice, essentially, that says you're not supposed to do certain things within the discipline because it doesn't fit. Well, things change.
It took 30 years or something, right? I feel like the work that he did was not acknowledged for a long time.
A long time. He was doing it, I think, in the 70s.
Mm-hmm.
So 70s you have to live long enough to get the Nobel Prize if you're lucky enough. So it was like 50 years later.
Wow.
I do think you've stumbled on a winning strategy, though, which is convincing people that you don't have to change that much. Because I think that the greatest fear is that some tombstone has to be changed or some grand marker somewhere has to be recarved.
We have to take back that Nobel Prize.
Yeah, it was funny because Stephen Hawking's equation is literally carved in stone. And so if you start to suggest that these things have to be changed, you wrote it so beautifully. I'd never actually seen anybody else do this, but I always talk about science having a psychological immune system. And when I was reading your book, I was so gratified to find that you had stumbled on the same thing, which is that people have these allergic reactions to ideas. And so what you have to do is you have to find a way to to code it in such a way that the immune system does not react. And I think that that's really the only way, is to convince people that no, you don't have to panic.
This is kind of what you think already.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. No, it is kind of, it's an ideological immune response. And so, yeah, you need to figure out to prevent that from happening. You either take the equivalent of steroids or something that is just not going to trigger it. And a lot of it is similar to the idea of triggering, such psychological triggering. Don't say certain words, don't do certain things. And then because the moment that you do that, your rationality is gone. And then emotions will take over and you can't even have a discussion anymore.
Absolutely.
This is one of the reasons, by the way, that I've been asked to do debates, like do a debate with Michael Shermer or somebody else. I won't do it because there's no way in a debate like that where I need to spend a fair amount of time, especially if there's an audience watching, which there always would be. How in the world can you present enough information and maintain rationality on everybody's part in a debate? Because a debate, especially a crafted debate, is designed to have two people fighting each other.
Yeah, it's not the right spirit for inquiry, I don't think.
No.
I think you have to really be explorers. You have to be co-explorers. If you have people with different theories, they have to be actually interested in updating their understanding. There's nothing to be gained otherwise.
Yeah, it's painful, and more importantly, it doesn't actually achieve anything. So,
do you know who Professor Dave is? The internet personality?
Professor Dave, no.
Yeah, he's not a professor, but he has this huge YouTube channel where he just he's just like Michael Shermer, but I think even more popular. And one of the most gruesome and horrific YouTube videos I've ever seen was him debating James Tour, the biochemist in Texas. And it was it was so sad. It was just, both of them were just...
They had gone completely limbic, right? It was...
Yeah, it was just an emotional... It was just so sad. It just reinforced for me how the debate is not the best way to get to the bottom of any piece of understanding.
No.
Yeah.
I mean, prior ideological commitments almost always mean that you'll never get to the bottom of something. And a debate is an opportunity to put your ideological commitments on display on a stage to win over as many people as possible. And so there's no room for anything else. So I understand that. It would be cool to watch you guys in conversation, though, not necessarily a debate.
Yeah, I've had conversations, even with people like Randy when he was alive. And that I do, yeah, Shermer once on a radio show, Ray Hyman privately, a number of times. Very, very different in private, right? Because this is part of the thing about adopting an ideological identity. You have your audience. You need to show that to your audience. I like to think that I don't have an ideological identity, but of course I do. Right? I'm defending 150 years of other scientists that are trying to study something.
I'd say you're actually, among the people that we've talked to, you seem to be more or less the same person on this podcast that you were when we met you without recording. And actually that's pretty rare. It's very common, especially with people who have institutional positions, that they're super cool and fun to talk to, and then you put a camera on them and they really lock up at least the subject window that they're willing to explore.
Yeah, that's partially because I'm very quick to admit that I don't know. Like I don't know. I know certain things, but a lot of things I actually don't know. And I'm not afraid to admit that because I'm very, very comfortable with ambiguity. And I also feel, unlike some scientists, especially science spokespeople, who are asked about something that they don't know about, but they feel compelled as a science spokesperson to then pronounce on it. If I'm asked something I don't know about, I say, well, I have no idea. I don't know what that is, which is, I mean, in a large scheme of things, almost everything. I can do a t-test. Does that work? I can play with MATLAB sometimes, but no, it really is that. That's why that phrase from Terence McKenna sticks in my head. That the more you begin to know, the more you realize how much you really didn't know in the first place. So, yeah, but it doesn't stop me. So, because in the last time we did this, last year I made this diffraction system. I'm not using a double slit system anymore. Mainly because of expense. use a double slit system, you need a camera, you need to do fancy ways of extracting data from it, which can be done, but it is hard to explain to people what you did unless they're an optics person. So with a diffraction grating, if you take a diffraction grating, shine a laser through it, a transparent one, you end up with a couple of dots. You end up with a dot straight through, and typically 2 dimmer dots on either side, and then dimmer and dimmer as it goes further out. But it's the way that the waves are combining, constructively interfering in this, it creates a very bright dot, and then 2 dots on either side. So all you need are 3 photodetectors. You don't need a camera. You're just looking at the illumination levels. Makes it much, much easier, both conceptually and analytically, to do it. So I made the entire thing, which I could show you if I grab one. No, it's too far away. I can't grab it. $150.
Wow.
So the last time that we made a double slit system, it cost $10,000. That's about the cheapest that we could make it. So $150, you'd say, well, that's not even like a thing. Well, it's a thing partially because I put the whole thing myself. If I were to charge for it, it would probably cost $1,000. But in terms of parts, it costs $150. And we did get interesting results with it, suggesting that actually the effect might be more robust than we think.
What are the results that you get?
Well, so I pre-registered a couple of hypotheses. This is a longer story, so I'll just cut to the chase. 2 of the hypotheses looked like they were significant. Of course, yay! It turned out that 2 of the boxes, I made 50 of these interferometers. I identified people who I thought could do it, sent it off. 2 of the boxes broke during shipping because I ship them to people around the world who I identified. And so I sent them new boxes, and then those 2 pre-registered hypotheses were not significant anymore. But a third hypothesis, which was exploratory, that was significant. So it's not quite as good as getting a pre-registered effect, but an exploratory hypothesis, which was very straightforward. It was an extension of the previous 2. Like those, to make it simple, if you have a distribution of results, you can take the mean, you can take the variance, you can take the skew, and so on. Those are different moments of the distribution. So I pre-registered the first 2 moments. It was the third that was significant, and all the data was good at that point. So the other thing I did, and I had some insight when I was thinking about this, normally we go for meditators in this experiment because the experiment requires that for 30 seconds, you send your mind inside the interferometer and you kind of pay attention to it psychically. And then you withdraw for 30 seconds. And you do this back and forth and back and forth. The reason why you would look at the mean and the distribution is because you're looking for a collapse of the wave function, which is a directional effect. The reason you look at the variance is because if you're able to do the 30-second task, you would be extremely unusual. Most people can do it for 5 seconds, and then they start dreaming about cheeseburgers. And then they remember, oh, I'm not supposed to think about cheeseburgers. They go back to thinking about it. And so you get this variance effect. It's a real effect, but it's kind of flopping all over the place while you're paying attention. And then there's a control period where you're not thinking about it at all. So if you're looking now at the variance between 2 things, we oftentimes see that significant. The third one, which is the one I didn't pre-register, is skew. And the reason why you end up at skew is because you're doing the task, and sometimes you can do it really well, but you can't sustain it. Well, what would that look like from a distributional perspective? It would look like skew. You're getting some outliers that are flopping one direction versus the other. That was significant. So I thought, okay, we normally get meditators because they probably can't do this task for 30 seconds because meditators don't do it that way. You do this for hours or many minutes, but not 30 seconds on and off. So the other thing is that meditators are good at this because they realize that they mind wandered, right? The difference between a really good meditator and non-meditator is that a non-meditator will start this, they'll dream about cheeseburgers, and they will continue dreaming about cheeseburgers for the next 2.5 hours. Whereas a meditator will do this, 5 seconds later, they're dreaming about cheeseburgers, and oh, I'm not supposed to do that. And they go back. So they can continually go back. Even very highly advanced meditators will do that. But then I thought, meditators are really good at inward focus of attention. And yet the box is over there. I want people who are really good at outward focus of attention. Well, who does that? Magicians, people who do spell casting, because it's high attention, high intention, out there. And so half of the people I got were meditators, half were magicians, esoteric magician types. The magicians did significantly better in this task.
Whoa.
So this is one of the very few times that particular class of people who are practiced in a kind of external meditation have been tested against sort of comparable meditators and shown that at least in this kind of task that involves mind-matter interaction, they actually did better. But that's pretty good. So I'm in the process now of writing that up. And the next grants that I've just submitted is to replicate this again, specifically going after magicians this time, because I'm now plugged into the worldwide magician web. So I have lots of candidates.
I mean,
That's
what's really
fantastic.
cool about that is if it's only $150 for the apparatus, lots of people could potentially reproduce that themselves.
Yeah. So in my article, I'll have a supplemental part which shows the PCB board and the components and all the rest of it. I made the enclosures with a 3D printer. I mean, it's sort of like hobby stuff, hobby level for that price, but it worked. And so the new version, I'm making it much fancier. So this will cost at least $1,000, maybe $2,000 per box. But I thought of a way of making it way more sensitive, I think. And so if I get the money for this, that'll be my next step.
Very cool.
Do you have any young folks that are taking on the mantle of this work that you're training for the next generation?
That has become a increasing concern as I discover I am not getting any younger. I only seem to be getting older, which sucks.
Somebody should study that.
Yeah. So there are lots and lots of young people and people sort of mid-career level that may be working in someplace else, and they want to get involved. I've done lots and lots of interviews, like coming up on 800 interviews. So I teach that way, and I teach through books. I have some graduate students at the doctoral level. It takes time. It takes more time than I feel I want to spend to mentor somebody to the point where they can take over. But what I try to do then is point them to others that are typically in universities that are doing this, the 40 or so around the world where you can actually get a degree in something like this. Otherwise, I spend a fair amount of time on email saying, well, you could do this. What should I learn? The answer is you should learn everything. You should learn as much as you can in the neurosciences and biology and physics and psychology and sociology and philosophy to start. And push them all as far as you can possibly go. And then learn as much about research methods as you can possibly manage, both in psychology and biology and elsewhere. And then start reading as much about the philosophy of consciousness as you possibly can stomach. And then you start going to conventions and present either ideas or research that you've done and find the people who actually have programs running, because they're not going to live forever. And this essentially is recapitulating what I did. I went to these conferences, met people, things come up and say, would you be interested in doing such and such? Yes, I would. That's how I've been able to do this my entire career.
I think that's really practical advice. There's sometimes people that are in positions where they've been studying something for a long time are speaking from an experience that is impossible to replicate. Like, we've had so many professors that in the 1970s got a job by making a phone call to some department and got a tenured position without so much as visiting campus, stayed there for their entire career, now have retired. They have no advice that's useful. But I think that what you've said here is really primary, because the experiments that you've described are accessible to somebody with a degree of technical knowledge and drive, where if you want to figure it out and you're creative and you understand how science works, you can do it. And obviously there's a pool of people that you can pull from that are curious and excited and would be willing to participate, and there's a community that's there. And so you just have to prepare yourself to participate in it, and that's almost enough.
That is a big part of it. So people often then at some point say, what's the most amazing psychic thing you've ever seen? And the answer is always the same. It is my career. Because you craft what you do from nothing. There is no career track. There's an enormous amount of pressure financially and socially not to do this. So you have to have an enormous amount of internal curiosity and motivation to actually do it. Those who have all of that need actually even more. You need skills. Many people who'd like to do this are, without denigrating this, are coming from a new agey perspective.
Mm.
They want to do something with the spirits and the psychics and whatever. Or maybe they're an artist or something like that. So what in those cases, I try to steer them, first of all, find out, do they have any technical skills? Well, sometimes they do. And I say, that would be great. You're a biologist. There's a huge range of things about psychic healing that would be really fun to study. And this is how you would do it. For somebody who doesn't have any technical skills, I'd say, well, there's still a possibility here because there's qualitative research. You can study what people report, and there are methods of doing that. You can do all kinds of interesting research by studying the stories that people say. I steer them towards anthropology or ethnology or something like that. My own preference, of course, is towards more of a physics and engineering perspective, because I personally like to play with things. They have little, my desk here is just strewn with things to play with. Like, I just got a toy today. Where's my new toy? This thing. See, so if an engineer, I turned my screen off so I can't see what I'm looking at.
Looks like a little electrical box of some sort.
Yeah. So we're doing an experiment. We call it telebelly. This is looking at gut feelings from one person to the next. So it's a part of a long series of studies where it was about the feeling of being stared at. And we measure physiological responses when we do that. I'll take my view away. And so normally we look at, we would put you in a shielded room and wire you up to look at your skin conductance or heart rate or something like that. And we put you in a different room, and every so often you get a message to think intently about your partner at a distance. And now withdraw your attention back and forth, like 1 minute each. Meanwhile, we look at your physiology and say, well, has your heart rate changed at all when you're being looked at or even thought about from a distance? And the answer is, yeah, your heart rate changes, your skin conductance changes, all of your autonomic system changes in predictable ways, usually in the direction of sympathetic arousal. That's almost always what we see. Unless you've been working on dyad meditations and the feeling of being stared at is calming because that's what you practiced. Then you get the opposite effect. It's like at some unconscious level, you know what's going on, and your body becomes either stimulated or relaxed, depending on what's going on distant. So it's kind of an unconscious form of telepathy. So what we're doing with telebelly is we put electrogastrogram sensors to look at peristalsis. And the idea in this is a replication of something I did years ago. We present the sending person. The receiver has the electrogastrogram sitting by themselves in a shielded room for a long time, half an hour. They know what the nature of the task is, but they don't know what the other person's doing. And what the other person is doing is watching a film that has different emotional levels to it. It's very happy, it's very sad, it's neutral, and sending that mentally to the other person and see how it affects the gut. So we did that experiment. We saw that when you're thinking happy thoughts, the other person's gut gets a little more active. And when you're thinking neutral as compared to neutral thoughts, which is sending nothing. So in order to mark in the electrogastrogram data what is happening, that we need something that sends marking signals. We have 8 different marking signals saying we're doing this, we're doing this, we're doing this, so we can chop up the data later. And so it wasn't working quite right. So my buddy back in the lab is sending me the equipment, and I'll use this to debug why is it not working. And I'll figure it out and send it back, and then they'll do it. So that for me, that's fun.
I love that so much.
I mean, it's all very science geeky stuff, but that's what I like to do.
I love your spirit. I love how you approach these questions and the tinkering background behind it that leads to this ability to affect real objects in the world. I know that tinkering is kind of I don't think that it's a deep enough word for the things that you do.
The 3D modeling program I use is Tinkercad. That's the name of it. So yeah, it's it's tinkering up to the point where you actually have devised what the experiment is like. Then you have the protocol, it's locked in. And at that point, it's not tinkering anymore. But up until then, there's a lot of tinkering going on.
I think that there is a picture of scientists that I develop sometimes, which is built on the back of somebody having an idea that isn't very popular. And that idea causes them a tremendous amount of pain over the course of a career because they're stewards of this theory that they really believe in, and they're just devoured by the ridicule or the negativity that comes towards them. And when I find people like you who are working on something that is in some ways esoteric and still not popularly accepted, but are able to maintain a sense of wonder and charm at it, it makes the world brighter. And I really appreciate that.
That's nice to hear. Thank you. What you mentioned, though, is something I've seen as well. And the difference is theorists versus empiricists, right? The theorist loves their theory. They are their theory. They identify with their theory after a while. And that's where the pain comes from. Because even if the theory is right, you may not live long enough to see that you're justified. An empiricist, I'm just out there testing stuff, right? I mean, sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't work. And if you think it ought to work, you try it again a different way and you keep banging away at it. So it's actually a lot closer to engineering. I'm making stuff, and then I ask the universe a question, I get the answer back. Sometimes I didn't realize I asked the wrong question. If I'm lucky, like if I'm smart enough, I realize, oh, I didn't ask that the right way. I need to do this instead. This is what the second generation diffraction interferometer is all about. I thought of a way of saying, oh, I can make this a lot more sensitive by adding this other thing into the mix. That's how it all. I mean, that's fun. It's making stuff.
It's beautiful.
Yeah, I'm so glad we got to talk to you. It's funny because we've been doing this show for a few years now, and many people have told us to talk to you.
And I was actually very nervous about it.
Why?
I wasn't sure what you were like. I'd watched your interviews with other people, and I hadn't gotten a very good read on your personality off of them. And you're very stoic, usually in interviews.
Really?
I feel like you are, yeah.
You must cut out the other parts. So this is one of the reasons why I thought to do a long form is because usually in a short form I don't have the time to I'm given a question, I have to do a riff to be able to get it out fast enough. In this case, the long form works because we have time. But I've never done one this long. So
yeah.
We're proud to have that distinction.
Yeah.
I think people are really hungry for it today, honestly, especially in the era of TikTok and Instagram. I think it's actually pretty profound that people are willing to listen to a 3-hour interview, and that's really attractive to people all of a sudden. It's kind of something to that.
On a 3-hour interview, our median listen time is 2.5 hours.
Wow. What is it that these people are doing where they have that kind of time?
Driving, working out, cooking dinner. We always listen to podcasts.
It's not always, the way I do it, I listen to long form podcasts too, and I don't listen to them all at once. I might listen, when I go running in the morning, I listen to one podcast and I'll just keep going every day. I'll listen to, another half hour of it every day or something like that.
Yeah. Okay. That makes me feel better because if I were to, if I do listen to this back, which I probably will, I'll play it at least on times 2. I don't have the patience even listening to myself on these things for that long. So
you'll remember us as chipmunks, then I assume.
Yeah, but after you do that for a while, it sounds perfectly normal, and if you slow it down, it is slow.
It's true. Yeah, we edit them on 2x usually.
Yeah. Well, Dean, we shouldn't keep you any longer. I really appreciate it. I hope we have a chance to talk again when your next book comes out, because it was a real joy.
Well, so I sent the manuscript to the editor. She said, "Okay, we're going to talk next Thursday." Which will be my first feedback from her about what she thinks should stay and go. And at that point, I'll also ask her, given what you've seen now, when do you think it's going to come out? And so maybe she knows at this point, maybe not. But then I'm already beginning to do interviews again. I stopped it for 6 months. I want to time it in such a way so that there's a buzz. I'm supposed to create a buzz. I don't know how to create a buzz. That's not my area of expertise, but I'm hoping that the publisher knows what that means and tells me what to do.
Can you tell people what the theme of the next book is to help with the buzz?
It's a follow-up of my book on magic. I wrote that 5 years ago. So here we are 5 years later, and more or less what I'm predicting in real magic in that book was that it looks like the scientific world is slowly evolving a new kind of worldview, which makes the stuff not quite as crazy as you might think. So here we are 5 years later, and it has changed so fast and so clearly in the direction that I was talking about in the other book. I figured I need to do another book now to show that we are right in the midst of a paradigm shift right now. And this is the consequences. And I was more or less asked to put in a couple of chapters on if you want to do magic, what do you do? And this is all written from the point of view of what I call the modern mind. It's people like ourselves who have been inculcated into a certain worldview and find it difficult to suspend this belief. And so I'm providing a way of saying, you can suspend it because you don't have to suspend it for very much longer because that will be our worldview. And when you're in the mix of it, these are the various factors that both historically and also tested in the laboratory in psi experiments, these are the factors that are associated with optimal performance. So that's, when I started looking into this, I knew about sigil magic. I never heard of not magic before. And there's not magic and word magic and candle magic and tinctures. And I mean, it just goes on and on and on. So the one I like is not magic. It's literally making little knots like this one. You take a piece of yarn, and as you're holding an intention, you pull the intention and capture it inside the piece of yarn in the knot. And the reason why that works for me is because it's kinesthetic. It literally takes this intention in your head, takes it outside, and the muscular action of doing that is like a way of forcing it in there. So what I like to do is I repeatedly do it and make a little man out of it. And so there's like I've captured this particular intention. And I then intentionally forget what it means because you don't want to dwell on it. So I pushed it into my unconscious. And so I, in the process of making little man, it means something. I don't exactly remember what it means, but maybe when it happens, the little man will remind me what it is. Meanwhile, it's sitting on my desk.
I love that. I really look forward to that. It sounds like it's going to be a really interesting read.
I hope so.
So reach out to us when you know when it's going to be published, and hopefully we can structure something else around it.
Okay, I will.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, Dean. Have a great rest of your day.
See you.
Bye.
See ya. Bye, everybody.